Offshore Petroleum, Laminaria and Carolina Decommissioning Cost Recovery Levy Bill 2021 and Treasury Laws Amendment, Laminaria and Carolina Decommissioning Cost Recovery Bill 2021. The Senate referred this inquiry to the committee on 21 October 2021. The reporting date is 18 November 2021. Submissions closed today, the 8th of November 2021. To date, the committee has received 5 submissions. These documents are available on the committee's website. As this is a public hearing, a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. However, the committee may determine or agree to a request to have evidence heard in camera. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings and claims of public interest immunity have been provided to witnesses and are available from the Secretariat. Any witness called to answer a question for the first time should state their full name and the capacity in which they appear. Witnesses should speak clearly to assist Hansard to record proceedings. To assist with the recording of this hearing, please ensure your microphone is set to mute when you are not speaking. I remind media representatives listening to follow the media guidelines and any instructions of the committee secretariat. I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off or turned their mobile phones to silent. I suggest to witnesses that any questions on notice asked of you should be noted by you today, and the Secretariat will send the Hansard transcript to you as soon as it is available. I advise you that any responses to questions on notice should be sent to the Secretariat by 4 p.m, Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, Friday, 12 November 2021, that is this week. There will be no extensions to this timeframe due to the 18 November reporting date. I now welcome the representatives from the Australian Workers Union and Offshore Alliance, the Maritime Union of Australia and Offshore Alliance, the Electrical Trades Union of Australia and the Australian Council of Trade Unions. So as I understand it, we've been given a list of the order of appearance and the opening statements. So if I could ask Mr. OBrien Evans, Deputy National Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia and Offshore Alliance. Are you there, Mr. Evans?
Yes, I am, Senator.
Okay. Do you have an opening statement to give us?
Yes, thank you, Senator Scarr, and I thank the committee for the opportunity to appear.
Thank you.
We'll be appearing as a group so as to avoid covering the same ground as far as that is possible.
Yep.
Just to clarify, my name's OBrien Evans. I'm actually the Assistant National Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia. I lead the union's work in the offshore oil and gas industry, along with our members who work in a highly skilled maritime crew and specialist divers in the offshore oil and gas industry, which the bill applies to. And to clarify, the Offshore Alliance between the MUA and the AWU was established in 2018. Since then, the Alliance has attracted around 2,000 members working in production platforms and other areas of work within the Alliance scope. We've established many new agreements covering these workers and also are active in raising health and safety issues within the oil and gas regulator, NOPSEMA. To be clear, we welcome and support the bill and the levy and understand it is part of the package of improvements to decommissioning requirements the government has put forward in legislation that is passed in August and NOPSEMA policies and directions. We do note, however, that one significant part of the enhanced decommissioning package remains missing in action. The requirements for the oil and gas companies to have financial security, to have their decommissioning liabilities covered. This is critically important given that the NOPSEMA Advisory Board has identified that the industry appears to not have had removal as the default consideration in their planning, nor have assets been valued on the basis of full removal, and that in some cases maintenance has not taken place to allow removal. We urge senators to make inquiries about this. The MUA and Offshore Alliance members will be the people carrying out the work funded by this levy. We currently have members working on the Northern Endeavour, the ex-Woodside Floating Production Storage and Offtake Vessel, which is a FPSO acronym, currently stationed on the Laminaria and Carolina oil fields. Our members would also be crewing the vessels that will ensure the Northern Endeavour is towed to a yard where it can safely be dismantled We'll be crewing the vessels that would dismantle and remove the mooring and structures that take the oil from the seafloor up to the Northern Endeavour. We'll be doing the highly specialised dive work at significant depth to permanently plug the oil wells and remove the umbilicals and pipelines to the oil field. Construction of these facilities is hazardous work, and decommissioning will be even more so, and it'll be specialised. The problem is there is every incentive for employers to cut corners to win contracts. We've already seen that incident in WA while the Simbad platform was being removed, which could have resulted in multiple fatalities. Decommissioning is a growing challenge for the Australian oil and gas industry, and was recently estimated that removal of oil and gas equipment and plugging wells will cost around 52 billion Australian dollars. There's currently 1,008 offshore wells, 57 fixed facilities, 6,500 kilometres of pipeline, 1,500 kilometres of umbilicals, and some 535 subsea structures such as manifolds. Most of the $50 billion spend will be on labour costs, along with vessel hire, but that's a lot of jobs. And a lot of this work needs to start now, as we estimate that at least 200 oil and gas wells and 10 platforms are already disused, some for 10 years or more. The government has indicated in their tender document for decommissioning of the Northern Endeavour that the project will set the standard for future similar activities in Australian waters. This levy is an opportunity to set this decommissioning work up in the right way to maximise the jobs for Australian oil and gas workers, the return to the Australian economy, and to ensure the best environmental and safety standards. Oil and gas workers want to do our part and utilise our specialist skills to ensure that we prevent pollution to the marine environment we work in. These jobs are also particularly important to the workforce as the world decarbonises, creating an uncertain future for our jobs in our industry. However, we are concerned that the bill, measures in the bill could have the opposite effect. The bill invents a new definition of decommissioning. Instead of using the established removal as a framework under the OPGGS Act, there appears to be no legally binding framework for either safety compliance or the environmental plan and the environmental compliance of this bill. The Resources Minister has the unilateral ability to reduce the amount of the levy and end it early, and we are quite sure that they will be under significant pressure from industry to do so. We also need to consider the impact on East Timor and Indonesia, located not too far from these oil fields. In March this year, some 15,000 seaweed farmers in Indonesia won millions in compensation because their crops have still not fully recovered after the 2009 Montara oil spill. International conventions and Australian law require us to remove oil and gas infrastructure, and this must be done properly. In our submission, we put forward a package of amendments which aim to improve safety and environmental regulation for the Northern Endeavour, and to use the opportunity for this levy to set up Australia's decommissioning task in the right way. Taylor Rundell from the AWU will talk to the specifics of those amendments, but they include measures to ensure 1, legally binding safety and environmental oversight, 2, the removal of all oil and gas equipment from the oil fields as per Australian legislation and international conventions, 3, that the levy is not ended before the work is properly complete, 4, that the jobs and economic benefit to Australia are maximised for this and future decommissioning projects, including setting up an Australian decommissioning yard, and 5, proper reporting and transparency. Zach Dunkoff from the AWU will speak next. He will cover off the issues currently facing our members on the Northern Endeavour. Then Matt Murphy from the ETU will cover electrical safety issues and the need for proper removal and disposal of hazardous materials that can be found on facilities like the Northern Endeavour. Then Taylor will cover the amendments we are recommending, and Liam OBrien from the ACTU will sum up. I hope that is acceptable to the committee, and I once again thank you all for the opportunity to appear today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans, and I think your order of proceedings makes sense. So we'll, without further ado, we'll go to Mr. Duncalf. Can you hear us?
I can. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So over to you, please.
Excellent. So good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to appear. So my name is Zach Duncalf. I appear as a representative of the Australian Workers Union. The AWU has broad industry coverage of the offshore oil and gas sector in Australia, and we've got thousands of members engaged in this sector. For the past few years, the AWU and the MUA in Western Australia have worked closely and collaboratively for the benefit of the workers in offshore oil and gas, and we established the Offshore Alliance, which has made a submission to this inquiry. As part of my role with the AWU, I coordinate the Offshore Alliance campaign and represent the Offshore Alliance membership in collective matters before the Fair Work Commission. As a result, I work closely with the Offshore Alliance organisers and members, and I'm aware of the issues facing workers in the offshore oil and gas sector. The AWU has members working for contractors on the Northern Endeavour FPSO, including a significant number engaged by the contractor providing the operations and maintenance services, which is Upstream Production Solutions. Recently, the AWU has been informed by members on board the Northern Endeavour of a number of worrying matters, including those addressed in the Offshore Alliance submission to this inquiry. I'll go through those one by one with a little bit more background now. So firstly, we have a serious injury that was sustained in September of this year by an AWU member, including fractured ribs, torn tendons, and a spinal fracture due to a fall caused by unsafe flooring on the facility. It was a hazard that had been raised with management previously, and apparently no action had been taken in relation to it at the time of the injury. Since the injury, the union's been informed that the floor has been haphazardly quote unquote fixed, but still not to an acceptable standard. So that still remains a hazard for those working on the facility. We've also had reports from members of unacceptable basic offshore safety induction and training qualification dispensations. So these types of dispensations are generally quite rare and used in extenuating circumstances for specialist personnel who then need to be shadowed during their time on a facility if they don't have that qualification. We've had reports made to us that a member of management on board the Northern Endeavour is granting these Boziet dispensations to office staff, including the company's health, safety and environment officer and others. We believe this is a poor reflection of management's attitude to safety, and also perhaps due to management's belief that they don't currently operate in a strict regulatory environment, which currently appears to be true due to the bankruptcy and administration of TS-OGA. We've also had reports of insufficient life rafts and fast rescue craft on board the facility for the number of persons on board, which is obviously worrying. And there's also an openly hostile attitude of at least one member of management on board the Northern Endeavour towards unions and freedom of association, which was conveyed to workers at a toolbox meeting on board the facility. The comments of the member of management, which included statements similar to "this is not a union vessel and will never be a union vessel," and also "anyone who wants to preach unionism can expletive off and take that propaganda with them," were apparently inspired by employees posting a bargaining petition to a notice board on the Endeavour, and the AWU sending correspondence to UPS requesting that the company commence bargaining for an enterprise agreement to cover their workers on board the facility. The approach by UPS to collective bargaining under the Fair Work Act is another worrying matter for the AWU and the Offshore Alliance, particularly if the Northern Endeavour is to serve as a best practice decommission, as it has been spruiked. The current enterprise agreement applying to UPS employees on the Northern Endeavour expired over a year and a half ago. And the AWU has requested that UPS commence bargaining. We made that request on the 8th of October this year, and we received no response to that request. On the 14th of October, the AWU sent UPS further correspondence in response to the reports of the member of management statements at the toolbox meeting, reminding them of the rights of their employees and also its obligations as an employer. Again, no response was received. On the 22nd of October this year, the AWU sent further correspondence to UPS requesting that it commence bargaining for an enterprise agreement under the provisions of the Fair Work Act. On the 27th of October, a response was received and UPS declined that request. 2 days after this response was received, members reported that a member of UPS management visited the facility to inform employees that the company did not want to negotiate an enterprise agreement with union involvement because it would be quote unquote quicker to negotiate an enterprise agreement without the union. On the 3rd of November of this year, the AWU applied to the Fair Work Commission for a majority support determination, seeing no other option to get the company to the table. So we're seeking an order from the Commission that the company commence bargaining with employees and their bargaining representatives for a new enterprise agreement. And we don't think that it should be that hard. In the experience of the AWU, employers that take a hostile approach to workers joining unions and having union representation are generally more likely to establish a poor culture at the workplace, and that's particularly in regard to safety. On the basis that the Australian government is footing the bill for the decommission, it is likely that the decommissioning of the Northern Endeavour will be used as a yardstick to measure future decommissioning projects against. The current conditions on the Northern Endeavour and reported approach by management to safety and freedom of association are far from what anyone would label best practice. It's clear to us, and it should be, we believe, clear to anyone with the facts, that significant improvement to the current operating practices and conditions on the Northern Endeavour need to be made. I'll now hand off to Matt Murphy from the ETU. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Duncalf. So, Mr. Murphy, are you there?
Yes, I am, Senator.
Over to you.
Thanks, Senator, and thanks, Mr. Duncalf, for handing off to me. Senators, today I've been asked to speak to you with respect to electrical hazards and environmental hazards arising from those matters. My name is Matt Murphy. I'm the National Industry Coordinator for the ETU. The ETU is a union of more than 60,000 members, both on and offshore within the Commonwealth, with a particular interest in the electrical contracting, electrical power and engineering industries. It's under engineering that offshore oil and gas falls within our organisation. And as a result, I'm the official responsible for it. The concerns that I've been asked to relate to you go to a number of matters, but first off, I'd simply say that I do support the submissions of the MUA and AWU and welcome the intent of the bill. However, issues that arise for us are in the nature of electrical hazards. One of the concerns we have is that due to the remoteness perhaps of Northern Endeavour, the application of Australian standards and licensing and qualifications may not be stringent as what may be experienced on shore. It is imperative in our view that any decommissioning work done on Northern Endeavour or on any vessel whatsoever be completed by appropriately qualified and licensed electrical workers. It should be clarified with respect to the Northern Endeavour the application of Australian standards subject to the location of the Northern Endeavour at any particular time with respect to the borders of the Commonwealth. And we do have, as I said, some concerns about the offshore nature of the Northern Endeavour being out of sight and out of mind, and the enforceability of electrical standards in the decommissioning work. A number of the issues that relate to decommissioning, noting that the Northern Endeavour was built in Korea, we're concerned about the presence of offensive materials such as asbestos. In a number of electrical appliances, there may be a substance called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. These matters, if not these types of materials, if not properly decommissioned and disposed of, if the whole vessel is not disposed of correctly and appropriately, cause a massive risk to workers and the environment. So legacy materials on board are an issue for us. The nature of the installation may or may not also have similar sort of legacy materials. Asbestos may or may not be used in some of the fireproof circuitry, and that is a concern that we have. One of the other concerns that we have with respect to decommissioning is the supply of electricity to the vessel at any particular time, and the nature of temporary wiring. Adequate lighting for work clearly needs to be adequate. Australian standards provide, particularly in relation to emergency egress, a minimum of 20 lux lighting for emergency egress from building and construction sites. These standards should equally apply to Northern Endeavour, and adequate lighting for emergency egress and indeed normal work should apply. That'll need to be installed by qualified electricians and maintained by them. So the installation of temporary power and light needs to be done by licensed and qualified electricians, needs to be maintained by them. Legacy materials and equipment, the environmental risks of that need to be dealt with appropriately and correct records kept. The final issue, or the final two issues I'd like to deal with, is the recording of works and drawings. Handing off the vessel from one owner to another, engagement of contractors and subcontractors, needs to be considered with respect to the record of works executed on the vessel. It is a personal interest to me, and through personal experience, having worked in the industry, been exposed to electric shocks by work being completed in substations that wasn't in accordance with the diagrams held in that substation. This can equally apply on vessels. So works is executed, and appropriate records, especially electronic ones, need to be up to date to ensure that those working on the vessel have an adequate record of the current status of the electrical wiring. The last matter concerns particularly isolation and earthing. All electrical work other than testing must be carried out in a isolated and earthed condition with codes of practice that apply onshore in the various state jurisdictions. These also need to be noted for the offshore nature of the Northern Endeavour and indeed other vessels that this legislation may apply to. Isolation and earthing, again, as a subset of the record of works and drawings, must be recorded adequately and ensure that there is no floating voltage available between earth and neutral, as a technical term, that could endanger the lives not just of the qualified electricians working on it, but other tradespeople and workers engaged to decommission the vessel. There are numerous technical challenges working with neutral and earth systems on vessels. Clearly, it's not something that you can adequately earth as an onshore installation, and these can give rise to dangerous voltages arising on neutral and earth circuits. These are matters that can only be adequately dealt with by properly trained, qualified and licensed tradespeople, and any activities conducted on the Northern Endeavour or similar vessels with respect to decommissioning and disposal must be undertaken by these people. Senators, I'm quite grateful for the opportunity to provide this brief statement, and thank you for that. And I'm happy to deal with any questions, queries, doubtful points you might have during the course of this discussion, or sorry, this hearing, or at any subsequent hearing or request that you might make. I stand ready to assist in any way possible. I'll hand to Mr. Rundell from the AWU with the consent of you, Senator.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Rundell, are you there? Can you hear us?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Scard, the senators on the committee, and to my union colleagues. My name is Taylor Rundell. I advise the AWU on a range of areas of industry policy, including oil and gas. As Adrian noted at the start of this hearing, the Offshore Alliance definitely supports a levy to fund the decommissioning of the Northern Endeavour. We've supported stronger measures to essentially ensure that decommissioning liabilities aren't avoided, and particularly where a title holder ends up in liquidation or otherwise unable to pay. However, at the moment, we think the measures are pretty bare bones. They establish a levy to fund decommissioning activity, but they don't really go much further in that. So we have some concerns that we believe would allow this measure to set the standard for the growing challenge of decommissioning. The first of these is that there is no safety regulator for this decommissioning activity from a legal perspective, because there isn't a title holder. Under the OPGGS Act at the moment, there needs to be a title holder for NOPSEMA to have jurisdiction. And because the Northern Endeavour's title holder is now insolvent, there isn't a title holder and there's no NOPSEMA regulation as a result. So DISA is currently in charge of the decommissioning task with NOPSEMA as an advisor on its task force. This puts it in the slightly unusual situation of facing less regulation than a private company doing the same activity. So our recommendation is that this legislation should specify that NOPSEMA is the regulator, and certainly that the exact set of legislation that applies to this activity, whether it's under the OPGGS Act or under the EPBC Act or whatever relevant environmental regulation might apply, it's set out in the Act. The second is that we see full removal of all infrastructure from the Northern Endeavour as the baseline to be achieved. So the OPGGS Act and NOPSEMA's policies refer to removal of infrastructure. They don't define the term decommissioning, whereas this legislation does define the term decommissioning, but it expands it. It says removal or any other treatment of infrastructure. Ordinarily, under NOPSEMA policy, you wouldn't be able to deviate from the requirement to remove infrastructure unless you had been given specific approval to do so. So we are a bit concerned that using a broader definition in this legislation would expand the meaning of decommissioning in all contexts. Because this legislation is about funding the decommissioning, we suggest confining that definition to decommissioning costs and then using the standing policies of NOPSEMA and the provisions of the OPGGS Act to guide it. And we also suggest putting in an explicit object into the Act and setting out a purpose for the levy, which sets removal of infrastructure as the baseline. The third area that we make a recommendation on is about the time frame for decommissioning. So to put it lightly, the time frame is set for the end of this levy by 2029, but we have no idea whether the task will be done by 2029. And further, as Adrian's mentioned, the Resources Minister can decide that the levy ends at any point, and he'll be under great pressure to do so. So the levy should apply while it's needed. There shouldn't be an opportunity to end it before the need for it is gone. Our fourth policy recommendation is one around this idea of setting the standard. We know that the decommissioning task is growing over time, and we see that there's an opportunity to use this decommissioning project as the start of an Australian decommissioning industry. In particular, we'd like to see a dedicated decommissioning yard here in Australia with training opportunities attached to it. Otherwise, a large part of this work in the future is not going to be done here in Australia and is likely to go to Southeast Asia. We'd like to see the government work with industry to establish training packages and potentially fund an institution with a sort of ongoing training program. We'd also like to see the opportunities for economic benefit and job creation from this project maximised. So we'd like to see that all tenderers for this project participate in Australian industry participation plans and also comply with rigorous standards for local industry. We set those out in more detail in the submission, but those go to making sure that the operators are fit and proper, and also that they take whatever opportunity they can to develop Australian jobs. And finally, the current specification of the levy in the legislation doesn't require much in the way of reporting or transparency on the collection of the levy or on what DISA does in decommissioning with the revenue they've earned from the levy. So we'd just like to see that those activities are reported on so that both industry workers and those paying the levy understand what's happening as a result of it, that it's not just money going into a black box. At this point, I'll pass on to Liam O'Brien from the ACTU. And thank you for your time, Senators.
Thank you, Mr. Rundell. Mr. O'Brien, can you hear us?
I can, Senator.
Excellent. Over to you.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to the other senators on the committee and also to my colleagues. I would also like to state at the outset that the ACTU does support the bill, and we also agree that this is a starting point. There are some significant gaps that need to be addressed. As you can appreciate, offshore oil and gas work is highly hazardous work. And when it comes to decommissioning, it is obviously magnified in terms of the hazards and risks that workers are exposed to. This is not just because the removal of hundreds of thousands of tonnes of equipment, both topside and subsea, presents significant risks to workers based on the state of repair of equipment and the issues around access of that equipment, but also in relation to the economic situation, which I'm sure, as others have noted, is very aware to the committee that decommissioning of assets is not something that businesses or operators will profit from, and it therefore is highly likely that it's exposed to cost-cutting practices. And others have talked about experiences elsewhere throughout the industry about how this has often played out, but it should not be understated that the issues that face decommissioning of these assets are really increased by the economic situation. I'd also like to talk about the fact that we really need to see this as an opportunity, not just to implement appropriate safeguards and regulations that protect workers and indeed the environment, but that we also see, as my colleague previously mentioned, the opportunity seized in relation to the jobs and the necessary capacity for Australian industry in order to decommission the assets that are needed over the coming decades. The first of those really is, given the size of the future work, making sure that Australia has that capacity. And what was mentioned previously about the establishment of an Australian decommissioning yard supported by Australian industry is very critical in terms of making sure that we can achieve the task of decommissioning assets over the coming decades. I'd also like to endorse the need to include Australian industry participation plans for all work over $1 million to ensure that we do maximise the economic benefits to Australians and Australian workers. We also need to make sure that we are using appropriately skilled workers and operators through this next phase. As has been previously reported by my colleagues, it is absolutely essential that appropriately skilled and qualified workers are used to do this work. And that is why it should be a requirement going forward that we have a minimum of 10 years experience for those that are engaging in decommissioning work. There is a significant volume of work that is due to come in the coming decades, and we must make sure that Australia has the domestic capacity to meet those challenges. I think, Senators, that probably summarises, and I'm very conscious of the time and giving the opportunity to ask some questions of both myself and indeed my colleagues, the importance of this. The one final overarching comment I would make really goes to the coverage of our work health and safety regime and making sure that those that are responsible for managing these assets are held accountable under the appropriate health and safety regime. And I note what's been previously said about the need for NOPSEMA to have the appropriate regulatory powers to ensure compliance. As my colleague Zach Duncalfe said, there have already been a significant number of incidents on the Northern Endeavour, and the very nature of decommissioning work lends itself to be highly risky and hazardous work that we should not at any stage compromise the ability of regulators to take the necessary action to protect workers' health and safety and the environment. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Brien. We do have really limited time now. I found those opening statements very, very useful, but I would like to provide an opportunity for my colleagues on the committee to ask some questions before we have to move on to our next segment of witnesses. So, Mr. Senator Chisholm, you have some questions for the witnesses?
I do. I'll try and keep it limited, but there are lots of issues to cover. I might start with the issue around NOPSEMA. So in the tender document, NOPSEMA's website refers to the Northern Endeavour facility no longer being regulated under the OPGGS Act framework. Under this bill, who do you understand has regulatory cover of the decommissioning?
I might take that. My name is Penny Howard. I'm the National Research Officer for the Maritime Union, and in that capacity also do work with the Offshore Alliance and the AWU. It's unclear to us. The bill doesn't nominate who is the regulator, either for the safety or the work, or setting the plan. It's simply not mentioned in the bill. And so that is a real concern for us. And I suggest that perhaps you could take that up with DISR and NOPSEMA when they appear later on, because it appears to us that there isn't a clear. We understand that NOPSEMA and DISR are overseeing it, but in terms of they're not the ones doing the work. It's contractors 500 kilometers north of the coast of Australia who'll be carrying out that work. So we really need to have good, strong enforcement practices, and we need the companies to know and understand that, and not to think that they'll be able to get away with whatever they like out there.
Is there any reason why you think it isn't clear that NOPSEMA is given responsibility for this?
I don't know. That hard for us to say. I think that's a question for them. I do think the government is probably under significant pressure from the rest of the oil and gas industry, who were not very keen on the concept of this levy at all, because they would effectively have to pay to decommission Woodside's former assets. So I suspect they're under a lot of pressure to reduce the costs and the expenditure on this levy, or maybe they just thought it was too difficult. Either way, we think it's a problem that does need to be urgently addressed.
Thanks, Chair. I'll leave it there. I've got some other questions we'll put on notice.
Thank you, Senator Chisholm. Senator Patrick.
Yeah, thank you very much. Firstly, did the unions actually make any submission to the consultation process?
Yes, we filed our submission on Friday, and it's up on the website.
No, so I'm talking about the department's consultation that it ran earlier in the process.
No, that was a bit unusual. We made a consultation to the department's enhanced decommissioning framework consultation that ran December, January last year, and that was fairly widely advertised and did have a reasonable length of time attached to it. Quite unusually, when submissions opened on these other aspects of the decommissioning task, they're actually very brief consultation periods, and we weren't notified of them either. There wasn't any notification sent to any of our organizations about them, and because the period was only a couple of weeks for each of them, we did actually miss them. It was a missed opportunity on our part, but we also think that the government should have made a greater attempt to contact organizations representing the workforce carrying out these projects.
So the recommendations that you've put to this committee have not been seen by the department. That's essentially what you're saying.
Yes,
Okay.
we have put submissions to NOPSEMA around other aspects of their decommissioning policy, and of course to DISR on their enhanced decommissioning framework, but not specifically on this bill.
Now, I understand that NOPSEMA, and this understanding is gathered from estimates hearings, are not the regulator. They give advice to the Northern Endeavour Task Force, and there's been a sign-off that somehow transfers responsibility to the minister. In that respect, who's the right body to advise on things like leaving components on the seafloor? Is it NOPSEMA still, or is it that sort of decision making? Should that rest somewhere else, or advice be taken from somewhere else?
Well, certainly as it stands right now for other projects, the proponents are required to file an environmental plan and an environmental plan that meets the requirement for full removal. And if they want to file a deviation from removal requirements, they need to justify that separately, and NOPSEMA needs to approve that. So they are a reasonable body to oversee that, but that process needs to be a transparent process, and one that other organizations have the ability to scrutinize and make input on. And it doesn't seem there's any transparency in the current process or ability to issue directions, issue prohibition notices, or issue fines if there are any problems with the way the work is carried out, either from a safety or environmental perspective.
Okay, there's a submission that's now in by APPIA that suggests quite the contrary to your organisation, that the government will keep this levy going for some period of time, and indeed there should be some statutory point at which the levy is stopped. What do you think is the realistic time frame for the decommissioning? And this, in some sense, goes to my last question. Is there some sort of technical trigger that tells us that the job is done, or is that also sort of subjective on the basis of your last answer?
That is a question that I actually had in reading this bill as well. I think it's a critically important question to answer, and I'd encourage you to raise that with DISR and with NOPSEMA. My understanding is that I've had a look at the directions that NOPSEMA have issued for the decommissioning work undertaken by other companies. So there's a series of steps that are involved in there, and work that needs to be completed to the satisfaction of NOPSEMA. There's about 5 different aspects to it, from plugging the wells, removing facilities, removing subsea equipment, preserving the natural resources of the area, and making good any damage to the sea floor and subsoil of the sea floor. And all of those things are attached to the satisfaction of NOPSEMA. So there must be processes in place that they have to ensure that work is done. And I suspect that if that work is not done, then the body holding that permissioning, understand, for example, under the EPBC Act, they'd be liable for significant fines if it was shown that that work was not completed according to the plan. And that's one of our concerns. There's not that basic accountability processes in what we're looking at before us.
Okay, thank you. I've just got really one more question. I actually have lots, but we've run out of time. But and I think this Mr. Duncalf was talking about working conditions on board the Northern Endeavour, if I recall correctly. It seems to me that UPS, if you work back through the original sort of KPMG reports as to what the cost was to run the vessel whilst in production, this is for UPS to be running the vessel, and the cost now under the Northern Endeavour Task Force is actually higher. And that seems odd to me, noting that it's in lighthouse mode, not production mode, and then coupled with your evidence, where's the money going?
That's a very good question, Senator. I wouldn't be able to answer that for you, but I also think that that is a very good question to be answered by someone who would know the answer. Okay, all right. So you're just confirming that there's something that doesn't quite reconcile correctly in relation to that? Yes, we're of the same opinion, Senator.
All right. Thank you. That's my truncated set of questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Senator Patrick, and I'd like to thank the witnesses from the MUA, AWU, ETU, the Offshore Alliance collectively for appearing before us today, and thank you for the time and effort you put into your testimony, the opening statements and your submission. It's greatly appreciated. And I would ask you if you could disconnect from the video conference. You're quite welcome to follow the rest of the proceedings through the parliamentary website, but we'll move on to our next witness now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
I now welcome representatives from the Wilderness Society of Australia, Inc. Thank you for appearing before the committee today, and thank you for your patience. We're just 5 minutes over time. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings has been provided to the witnesses and is available from the Secretariat. If I could ask each of the witnesses from the Wilderness Society to introduce yourselves, and we'll provide you an opportunity to make an opening statement, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here today. My name is Jess Lurch. I'm the National Corporate Campaign Manager for the Wilderness Society. And I might ask Tim to introduce himself as well, and then I'm very happy to provide a really short opening statement on both of our behalves and our members' behalf.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Senator. My name is Tim Bashara, and I'm the Manager of Policy and Strategy at the Wilderness Society.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we could hear the opening statement then.
Thank you very much. The Wilderness Society is interested and concerned about the decommissioning issues plaguing the offshore oil and gas industry, because when decommissioning or maintenance is delayed, poorly or incompletely done or avoided, it increases risks to our marine environments, as well as to workers' safety, other industries like shipping, and to communities. As we've seen with the Northern Endeavour debacle, it also presents significant risks to the Australian taxpayer. These increased risks must be avoided. Communities around Australia, from the Bight to King Island and northern Tasmania, the Victorian Surf Coast, and Newcastle and Sydney's northern beaches, are already bearing risks beyond those they are willing to accept, because this industry imposes itself on them against their wishes. We support this levy. I think we are all well aware that the Northern Endeavour mess tracks back to Woodside. Now the government has to clean up that mess, and we strongly support the important precedent that the industry must pay for these cleanup costs, not the taxpayer. If the UPS reports about the Northern Endeavour are accurate, then our view is that Woodside was fortunate to avoid legal sanctions for letting it fall into such disrepair, and we believe that they really haven't been made properly accountable for what has occurred. But we are already seeing decommissioning problems beyond the Northern Endeavour. Woodside's Nanhara riser turret mooring, for example, and general directions having to be placed on numerous elderly SO BHP assets in Bass Strait. It is already clearly becoming a problem. And yet offshore decommissioning is in its infancy in Australia, and we are seeing the barest tip of the iceberg, with far more decommissioning liabilities and far more problems yet to come. And frankly, an offshore oil and gas industry that has an overwhelmingly vested interest in wriggling out of these very substantial cleanup costs. Decommissioning isn't profit-driven, which I actually heard the previous witnesses say as well. It's responsibility-driven, and we'd suggest that fossil fuel multinationals are very good at the first and not so much the second. Layer over all of this the climate transition risk that we are facing, and this all looks likely to become a very big problem in the decades to come. What if other jurisdictions around the globe that are capable of a clearer-eyed read of the International Energy Agency's modelling and the IPCC's advice than Australia act to bring forward decommissioning in their regions to ensure that they don't get stuck with these cleanup costs? Where will that leave Australia? We believe the Commonwealth Government should be requiring these companies to publish their full decommissioning schedules, like they do for their exploration programs, and for these to be stress tested against various emissions and closure date scenarios. The levy is a good and necessary start, as was the recent and welcome, albeit too late, introduction of trailing responsibilities for previous title holders. But it's simply not enough to inoculate Australian taxpayers from more Northern Endeavours, which is why we strongly advocate that it should be made permanent, and that we must be open to increasing its rate if or when it is demonstrated to be insufficient to provide full financial assurances for the Australian Treasury and Australian taxpayers. It is also crucial that the government commits and puts itself in the best position it can to ensure that the Northern Endeavour is decommissioned to the highest possible standard, with all property safely removed and the environment fully remediated. We believe it is necessary to remove any real or perceived pressure from the industry to cost cut this important environmental remediation and potentially lower the standards and expectations for all decommissioning in this country into the future. We ask the Senate whether this committee or others, to maintain your focus on decommissioning. It is an area that every Australian has an interest in, and that if we get wrong, the consequences may be enormous for the environment, for worker safety, and for the taxpayer. Thank you very much. We welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lurch. Senator Cox, are you there? Can you hear me? Senator Cox?
Yes, hi. Thank you.
Oh, okay. You have the call to ask questions of the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses appearing today. In your submission, you note that the levy should be made permanent. Can you explain why the levy should be made permanent and what are the benefits for this?
I'm happy to start, Senator. So I think there are a couple of really key reasons from our perspective, and one I've touched on in my opening statement. We are very concerned that this won't be the only challenge that we face in terms of decommissioning, particularly noting just how much more is coming down the line, and the quite blatant and honest reality that there just aren't significant incentives in the way that there are in terms of profit for exploration and production for these companies in terms of dealing with decommissioning. There simply doesn't exist those same financial incentives that drive so much of the work that they do in the decommissioning space. And so unless we can really lock down requirements and responsibilities, I think there's every chance that we will face more and more issues. I think that the very strong reality is that, you know, as we transition, and certainly as the globe transitions, in terms of having to actually deal with climate change, we do have a question of how, you know, will these trailing liabilities continue to work into the future? It may simply be that some of these companies that we are assuming we can trail liabilities back won't necessarily be in a position in 2030, 2040, 2050 to deal with those liabilities. And I don't think we've really stress tested the risks of that yet. So my strong view is like maintaining this levy in a permanent way. We can do two things. One, actually provide some real financial assurance into the future for the Treasury and the Australian taxpayer for problems in the future. We don't want to deal with them all on a case-by-case basis as they come up, and we have had to deal with the Northern Endeavour. I also think it means that we could potentially use any additional funds available to build the capacity that's going to be required to actually do this work, which the industry and the regulator have both identified are significant challenges. The third reason I think it's very important for this levy to be made permanent is I believe that it will help remove the risk that we are facing with this particular bill at the moment, which is we have an end date that it's very unclear how that has been determined based on exactly how much this decommissioning for the Northern Endeavour will cost, but also the bill allows the date to be brought forward. And I think there is an issue there of having either an end date or the ability to bring the end date forward that has the potential, either real or perceived, to suggest that pressure might be applied on the Commonwealth to cut costs on this particular decommissioning activity. And that would be a real shame, I think, either real or perceived, if that was the case. My preference would be for this levy to be made permanent. And when the decommissioning has been fully completed to the best possible standards, then we can consider what rate that might need to be going forward.
Right, just as a follow-on question, do you have any independent or transparent information about the total decommissioning liabilities held by oil and gas companies, and why is this so important?
I might jump in there, Jess, if it's okay. The Wilderness Society's interest in this issue came about from Appia's own reporting. It was actually their reporting, almost like belling the cat, about the $60 billion liability that they're facing, the industry's facing, and their own struggles in their confidence in they're able to deliver on those liabilities. It was actually very clearly reported in their own work, in their own sort of annual reporting around their concerns for this. And that really drew our attention, because an old rusty oil rig in the middle of the ocean is an enormous risk, not just to, workers' safety, but the things that can go wrong for the environment. And obviously, we're really interested in seeing these things, seeing the ocean floor remediated to what it was like before as much as humanly possible. And the sort of in terms of that question about transparency and independence, what we don't really have, like, the key issue for the Senate here is transparency and understanding. You don't really have oversight around who owns what, how much they believe it's going to cost to remediate each site, when they're going to do it. And you also then don't have any oversight over any judgment or assessment whether you believe they've got the financial capability to do so. The thing about the decommissioning liabilities is there's not a bond put aside for the, for the packing up of these topside oil rigs or the lifting the pipelines off the seafloor and taking away. In effect, what they are required to do is provision what they believe it costs now for the net present value for the decommissioning liability for when they intend to undertake that decommissioning. And that was really complicated and sounds silly, but what it is it's how much they believe it's going to cost based on how much they think they're going to either take away or leave behind. So you don't get to see how much they believe they think it's going to cost. You don't get to see what they are currently planning for leaving behind or taking away, whether they intend to leave the pipeline on the seafloor, whether the regulator has said they should or shouldn't do it or not. And what you don't get to do is see when they intend to do it. And the when question is probably the most important question of all, because if they have internal planning, like internally planned to decommission something in 2050, they apply a discount rate to that. That means they take away 7% of that value from now until 2050, based on what they intend, what they believe it will cost then, and then bring that forward to now. So something can be penciled in as they believe it's $1 billion or $1.5 billion to pack up and take home. But if they believe they're going to do it in 20 or 30 years' time, it might only need to sit on their books as a $150 million liability. And you don't get to see that when. So if all of a sudden the regulator comes along and says, actually, you are well overdue decommissioning this site, and I expect you to do it in 3 years' time, they have to bring that forward. And all that internal accounting that they're doing needs to be made transparent. And we don't know if these companies have actually provisioned to do so. Like, we really don't know, because we don't know the scope of the works. We don't know what they've costed themselves to do so. We don't know when they're going to do it. We don't know if what's provisioned currently on their books and what is reported to the public and reported to the Senate is actually the same as that $60 billion. So if you look through the annual reports of the financial reporting of any of the major oil and gas companies now, you will not get $60 billion, penciled into their provisioning. You'll get $1.5 billion here and $150 million there. It probably adds up somewhere between, I don't know, $3 and $5 billion full stop, not 60 billion. So all of that, they are basically internally working out they're going to do this off in the never, never. Like, it is and so therefore, if what Jess was saying, the world does follow along these IEA trajectories, where these products, these oil and gas, are no longer required by the world, they're not producing income, they're not producing oil and gas, they're not selling things. They are not only not getting income, they have to do that decommissioning now rather than in 20 or 30 years' time. So it's going to be.
Can I just interrupt very quickly? And thank you. That's very, very interesting information and really helpful. Given that, and that there's no measures in this bill that require reporting on decommissioning, how would you strengthen some of that reporting and transparency of this bill so that industry and government fully completes it to sort of the best practice standard of decommissioning? Are there any particular ideas you might have?
Do you want to answer that, Jess?
I can suggest one, Senator. I'm not sure that it necessarily is pertinent directly to the Australian government doing this properly, but one proposal that we have is that when companies bid for exploration licenses, part of that bidding process is a really clear plan of what they will spend on exploration and when. that gives some genuine transparency. So everyone seems to be really happy to be transparent about, their efforts to expand. But there isn't the same thing for decommissioning. And we believe if there was a similar work program and commitment in the same way that those work program commitments work for exploration licenses, for decommissioning, that was really specific and clear about the assumptions that were being made and being really transparent with the public about when they would do that decommissioning, what it would involve, over what time frame. I think not only would we be able to have much better transparency about what we can expect to go on and how much money might be needed to do that, including for investors in these companies, by the way, because I think it is very material for them as well. But also it would make it much easier, in my view, at least, for us to build the capacity in Australia that we're going to need to do this type of work. It's quite hard to invest in developing such a new and large amount of necessary capacity when you don't have a transparent understanding of what works are being proposed and when. So I think that is one way that we could improve the situation is actually look at something very similar in terms of dedicated, committed work programs for which the government can take action if they're not met, in the same way that we do for exploration.
And just one other thing to add to what Jess said then when she touched upon investors, I think this is actually a role for ASIC and maybe the broader private sector in this in general as well, in having higher expectations on reporting to the stock market around some of these decisions. I think these decisions are totally material to the balance sheet of these companies and totally material to the share price of these companies. We've seen that in that the share prices have oscillated up and down with reporting, for example, around what is the liability associated with BHP's Bass Strait oil fields. Share price has gone up and down with those things. And if you look at the questions at the AGM that were being asked, I think it was at AGM, around the merger or the BHP demerger, a lot of investors were asking, what are those liabilities? When are they going to be? And they provided a level of information. But I almost think it is now in that sort of wider bucket of climate risk that financial regulators are looking at. This is kind of a bit of a black hole that they haven't yet brought into that wider realm and how they're engaging with those issues. And I think it would be good for them to start seeing that because it's a very material transition risk issue for these companies and for investors of those companies.
Senator Cox, Senator Patrick has some questions.
Yeah.
Could
Thank you
I
for
move?
the question. So happy to hand over to Senator Patrick.
Thank you very much. Senator Patrick, if you could keep it quick, our next witnesses are online.
I understand that, Chair. Thank you. I just want to check to see whether you had the opportunity to make a submission during the industry consultation period, which I believe ran from December 2020 to January 2021. So when the department were probably enjoying their Christmas break.
Yes, Senator, no, we didn't have the opportunity.
Okay.
Just too many things, really.
Sure, thank you.
Nothing more than that.
Thank you. Do you think it's unreasonable to do what they did?
Look, often consultation periods occur during those times.
Okay.
I would say.
That's a different answer.
We are very used to it.
Okay. So this levy is about a post-event approach in the context of the Northern Endeavour, and noting the concerns you've raised. Is it not proper that we should have a system in place where money is set aside? I think Mr. Bashar mentioned a bond. Money is put aside as the project progresses, perhaps a trust that can be transferred across to a new owner. Is that what's actually needed in addition to this bill?
We've definitely seen it in other jurisdictions where it's more the norm that that sort of thing happens with this industry. I mean, we see it, a lot of the mining projects onshore. I think the nature of the speculative nature and the high risk industry that is oil and gas, high risk, high reward, means that the government's been reluctant to provide that sort of more stable system. But I think what is emerging in terms of this ongoing liability. And it's not just Woodside. I think if you look at the number of improvement notices and directions notices that are being applied to the two oldest fields, the Northwest Shelf and Bass Strait, it is looking like it's all happening again in terms of the decommissioning is not being done when it should be, as fast as it should be, and there's this interaction between maintenance costs being cut at the same time as this. So I think the Senate is right to be looking for longer term solutions where the industry has to bear the risk. The problem was really clear with the Northern Endeavour is that the risk was borne by the taxpayer and by the environment and by the workers, not by the companies involved. Yes, a particular company, a smaller company may have gone bankrupt, but Woodside has come out of this really well. Like, we are not discussing Woodside paying for this, we are discussing the whole industry paying for this. And in fact, you may well argue that their positioning to be able to access the Bass Strait assets is because some of these regulatory risks that we're talking about now has given them an inside running into understanding how the system may work. So I think you as a senator and the Senate and this committee need to be thinking about what a more long-term solution is, whether it is a bond, whether it is much more radical transparency about when and where these things have been doing and the provisioning that's been done. Even that itself would be a radical step. I mean, a very significant step, because it will allow investors to make real decisions, because currently they're completely in the dark.
Okay, and just maybe take this on notice, noting that the chair wants me to move on. Can you provide some examples of those other jurisdictions and the approach that they take, and any points to legislation where a bond arrangement is established through legislation, such that I might, because I'm not one to shy away from putting amendments up to bills.
We'll take that on notice if that's okay, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Scarr. You're on mute, Chair.
If I could thank the witnesses for joining us today, and if I can ask you to leave the video conference, but you're more than welcome to go into the parliamentary website and follow the balance of proceedings. But thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
I now welcome the representatives from the Australian Petroleum Production Exploration Association. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings has been provided to witnesses and is available from the Secretariat. Witnesses should speak clearly and into microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. It should also be noted that answers to any questions on notice should be noted by you today, and responses sent to the Secretariat by 4 p.m. this coming Friday. There'll be no extensions to the time frame. I invite the witnesses from APIA to make an opening statement if you would like.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Andrew McConville. I'm the Chief Executive of APIA. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Ashley Wells, who's the Director of Federal Government Relations, and Simon Staples, who's the Director of Fiscal Policy. So we appreciate the opportunity to be here before the committee today. APIA, or the Australian Petroleum Production Exploration Association, is the peak national body representing the upstream oil and gas explorers and producers active in Australia. Our membership accounts for approximately 95% of Australia's petroleum production. Australia is, as I'm sure the senators know, a leading producer of oil and natural gas and a significant driver of the Australian economy. In 2020, the industry was responsible for over 3% of GDP and 12% of Australia's merchandise exports. And in fact, we are Australia's second largest merchandise export, larger than coal and second only to iron ore. Over the past decade, the industry has invested around $473 billion into the Australian economy and paid more than $66 billion in taxes and royalties. And those taxes and royalties are obviously utilised by governments of all stripes to build hospitals, schools and roads for communities across the country. The bill we're discussing today, the Offshore Petroleum Bill 2021 and the Treasury Laws Amendment, Laminaria and Coralina and Decommissioning Cost Recovery Bill 2021, introduce a temporary levy on offshore petroleum production to recover the Commonwealth's costs of decommissioning and remediating the Laminaria and Coralina oil fields and the associated infrastructure. The levy is designed to ensure that taxpayers are not left to pay for decommissioning and remediation of production facilities and associated infrastructure with those oil fields. At the outset, it's very important to note that APIA agrees that taxpayers should not foot the bill for industry costs. The Australian oil and gas industry recognises that the effective decommissioning of projects and associated infrastructure is an essential requirement and is framed as part of the business case of any oil and gas project from the time of its exploration and inception through to its conclusion. It is for that reason that the oil and gas industry supported the recent amendments to the Offshore Petroleum Greenhouse Gas Storage Act to expand existing powers to call back previous title holders to decommission infrastructure and remediate the marine environment in the tidal area, otherwise known as trailing liabilities. Notwithstanding this, APIA remains very concerned about the introduction of a levy applying to all offshore operators in Australia. The signal this levy sends to an industry looking to further invest in new energy supply and emissions reduction in Australia is a negative one. The levy poses fiscal and investment challenges by setting a very dangerous precedent in that financial culpability is unlikely to receive the necessary focus if it is assumed by the broader industry. This includes where those that derive no commercial or financial benefit from the resource will be held to account to meet the costs if anything goes wrong, even in circumstances where the sale and transfer of an asset were approved by the government without broader industry consultation or involvement. In broad overview, the submission which we lodged today encourages the committee to consider improvements to the design of the legislation to ensure that it achieves its intended policy outcome. That is, to ensure that the levy is designed in a manner that recovers the cost of government decommissioning and remediating the Laminaria and Corallina oil fields and associated infrastructure, and only those costs. APIA remains concerned that as drafted, the levy has the potential to run until the 30th of June 2030. We estimate that the levy is likely to collect approximately $380 million per annum, potentially resulting in a minimum of $3.4 billion being collected over the life of the imposition bill. In our view, this far exceeds the time frame and the cost needed for the relevant decommissioning activities, and hence the total amount of expenditure that would need to be recovered. In our submission, we note specific measures that should be adopted. These include legislating that the levy applies for no more than 4 years to end on the 30th of June 2025, automating the termination of the levy once all costs related to the decommissioning activities of the Laminaria Corallina oil fields and associated infrastructure have been recovered by the federal government, legislate that the Australian Taxation Office can vary the levy rate down in circumstances where the amount collected by the levy in any year would exceed total unrecovered costs without the need for a legislative instrument, legislate an annual transparency review and reconciliation process that discloses the amount of decommissioning expenditure incurred by the government, the amount of expenditure the government expects to incur over the following 12 months, and how much has been recovered by the government through the levy to that point in time. And finally, legislate mechanisms to deal with overpayments. With that, Senator Scarr, I'd be very happy for myself and my colleagues to take questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr McConville. I might kick off if I could. And I don't know if you've been following the testimony of the previous witnesses in relation to the inquiry, but I'd like to put a few general questions to you first about the industry. And that is, from your perspective, the importance the industry places on decommissioning occurring in a safe and effective manner that meets all the environmental requirements and discharges the industry's social licence to operate. What can you say in terms of where your members are at in terms of how they assess the importance of decommissioning in terms of their legacy?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, the importance, I mean, the industry places enormous importance on the appropriate decommissioning of all its facilities, and that is part of the normal development process and has been the case since the industry commenced in Australia. So as part of the process of, for example, developing field development plans, the processes that will be required at the end of life are very clearly set out, and there is an ongoing collaborative working relationship with the regulator to ensure that those liabilities, when they come due, are being met. So there is a legislative and policy framework that is in place. The government has recently updated that legislative and policy framework. The industry was very supportive of all of the changes proposed by government in that framework. So it is one of industry's key commitments to being able to responsibly develop the resources here in Australia.
In terms of the recognition of those liabilities on members' balance sheets, and the concern was raised that maybe the true cost of those liabilities isn't reflected on members' balance sheets. Isn't the case that most of your members go through pretty rigorous audit processes, in particular if they're listed public companies? So the recognition of those liabilities, contingent liabilities, would be the subject of a quite rigorous review through those audit processes?
Senator, it is absolutely the case that all of our members are subject to very rigorous requirements, both from the regulator in terms of NOPSEMA, and also if they are listed public entities, of course, for transparency regulations that relate to them being listed public entities through ASIC. All of those liabilities are audited and very transparently disclosed. It is very important to note, I think, at this juncture, Senator, also that in the process of developing those field development plans at the start of, let's say, the life of the development of the field, an estimate is provided to ultimately what that decommissioning liability will look like at the end of the field. That field may have a life of 30, 40 or 50 years. So over that time period, that is continuously revisited and updated to accord with the status of the assets, the life of the field, what's going to deliver the best environmental outcome. And that's a process of ongoing consultation with the regulator to ensure that adequate provision is made. And that may change over time. The estimate that was made when a field was developed versus when a field can be decommissioned may change significantly depending on the environmental circumstances relating to that field, whether in some instances, for example, it may be better to leave some of the subsea infrastructure in place as delivering a better environmental outcome, which has implications as to the cost. It may also be the case that the decommissioning can be sequenced with fields being decommissioned in that same area. So using sharing the resource, if you like, of equipment required to decommission can have an impact on the cost. So there is a very transparent process of working with the regulator. There are absolutely financial disclosure requirements for all of our members, and that process is entirely transparent and very strongly committed to by our members, because at the end of the day, if it's not, then the implications of that for their ongoing operations in this country are very, very significant.
And Mr. McConville, do you have any examples, and I haven't had the chance to go through your submission in detail yet, but does the industry have any examples, ideally Australian-based, of decommissioning best practice where a field has gone through a decommissioning process effectively, so we can see what, from the industry's point of view, best practice is, or even international examples?
I think, Senator, the submission as made focuses deliberately and directively on the levy and the associated operational levy, so it doesn't go into a broader discussion around decommissioning policy. That work was done in terms of our submissions to the government in the development of its decommissioning policy framework, the legislation for which was passed by the Parliament earlier this year, and that sets out a number of examples and recommendations around policy refinement. And if I may, Senator, I think the best point of referral is industry submission to that process of review, and happy to take that on notice and provide that submission and indeed related documents to the committee if it would help.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll now share the call to Senator Patrick. You've got some questions?
Chair. Mr. McConville, you originally were very critical of the scheme when it was first announced. I presume you had the opportunity to make a submission during the consultation period between December and January?
Yes, Senator, we did.
And is it your feeling that your points were largely taken into consideration?
I think some elements of what we put forward, Senator, were taken into consideration. Our preferred position would be that a levy was not imposed at all. And of course, that was not taken into consideration, but we are where we are now. And we do believe that there are further changes that could be made to the legislation to improve its operation and the application of the levy.
So it's your position that the taxpayer should have borne the cost of the Northern Endeavour?
It's not what I was saying at all, Senator. What I've said is our preference was not to see a levy imposed, and that we would continue to work with the government to see if there are alternative options available. But this is, as I've said in my opening statement, industry has responsibility for the cost of decommissioning, and that remains our position.
Okay, so but let's talk practically. What are the practical ways in which Northern Endeavour can be dealt with if it's not by way of a levy?
I think the industry has continued to seek to work with the government to find alternative solutions. Senator, they're not discussions which APIA as an industry association has been party to, because they are commercial discussions. But I do understand that those discussions are still underway, and we would continue to maintain the position that we would prefer the government to work with industry to find a sensible solution, and a levy is a fairly blunt tool. That said, Senator, that's what's before us now. The decision has been made to implement a levy, and so our focus is now on ensuring that the levy in its design and its operation is as effective and as efficient as it can be.
Okay, you might have heard some comments by the previous witness in relation to a statement saying you're of the view that there's about $60 billion of decommissioning costs ahead for the industry. Firstly, can you confirm that's the position of APIA?
That was not an APIA study, Senator. That was a study done by an independent agency that estimated, I think, that the levy was, the industry's decommissioning liability was between 50 and 60. We can make that report. It was by Advisian, I believe. We can make that report available to the committee, Senator.
I just wanted to put it on the record that whether or not that came from you, so that's fine. Do you accept that sort of quantum?
I mean, it's not for me to say, Senator, one way or the other. That's not work that APIA does. What I can say is that the independent assessment by Advisian that was done for independent regulatory agencies estimated that was about the liability. Now, that's at this point in time, and I think it's very important to note, Senator, that there are liabilities coming due in the next 5 to 10 years, 10 to 15 years, and beyond. And the further out those estimates go, of course, that may change over time. But that was the estimate that was provided and the work that was done at this juncture.
Okay, and so noting that fairly significant amount, and also claims that there's a lack of transparency as to how that's covered. In your submission, you call on the government to be transparent about costs, and look, most of the things you've called for are things that the Senate can ask for anyway, and obviously you're arguing that it should be made available voluntarily. I note that in estimates, finally the department handed down a copy of a report that ACL Allen had produced in relation to transparency. Is the industry adverse to the idea of opening up transparency around provisioning for decommissioning?
Well, I would argue, Senator, that transparency exists in the process of the field development plans and the processes of working with the regulator, seeking approval of field development in the first place, and the processes of consultation that exist through that. If there are shortcomings in that, then that is a separate policy issue for the government to determine whether it believes its transparency measures as required in the development of resources is appropriate or not. What I can say, Senator, is that the industry works closely with and accords with all of the regulatory requirements put down under the processes for developing and decommissioning Australia's resources. So if it's a broader question of policy, that's a matter for the government, not for APIA. We accord with the framework that's put in place.
Okay, so if we look with somewhere between $50 and $60 billion worth of decommissioning costs ahead, where would I go to find out how each of the companies have provisioned for that? And if I followed your your suggested course of action to do that, would I come up with those numbers?
I'm not sure, Senator. That's probably work that you'd have to do. What I can say is that companies are required under the existing legislative and regulatory policy framework to make it very clear to the regulator how they are going to decommission the fields that they own and operate. And that is a process of regular and ongoing review. If they are publicly listed companies, then those items will be appropriately accounted for on balance sheets. And if they are private companies, then it is a matter of working with the regulators to the regulator's satisfaction that adequate provisions are being made.
But if it's a public risk, surely the public ought to be made privy to those sorts of provisioning, even for a private company.
There is a process of consultation that exists through the development of through the field development plan process that includes public consultation, Senator. Yeah,
but I'm just talking about public transparency. I mean, you're calling for transparency because there might be a cost on your side. Why would I be wrong in calling for or seeking to amend this bill to force transparency upon your industry in order to satisfy the public that their risk is covered off?
I think the important point to note here, Senator, this bill relates to the specific operation of the levy as it's being imposed in relation to the decommissioning of the Lemcore fields. If it's a broader issue of policy, the government went through a process of consultation and development of a decommissioning framework and amended the OGGPS Act earlier this year, and that's the framework which includes trailing liability to manage the issues of broader decommissioning policy. So to my mind, Senator, that would be the appropriate mechanism whereby this was dealt with. I think the focus of this is about the operation of this levy in relation to cost recovery for this field.
Yeah, but in amending an act, there's nothing that prevents someone like me putting in an amendment to make good where there are shortfalls. I mean, that's part of the committee process is not just to look at what the government's proposed. It might be appropriate for us to amend things, amend the bill to reflect the will of our constituents.
You may wish to do that, Senator. I would offer a note of caution in terms of the effect that might have on the further development of Australia's resources in terms of creating uncertainty. And that's why we had a broader policy discussion and policy framework development process for decommissioning. And I think the risk of broadening out the reach of this particular piece of legislation beyond cost recovery for this field, I would submit would create the risk of greater uncertainty and impact on investment and development of the industry more broadly. But that, of course, Senator, is your purview to determine to do that or otherwise.
Sure.
Senator Patrick, we're running a little bit behind time. Do you have one last question?
No, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Chisholm.
Thanks, Chair. Just in general terms, I just wanted to get a sense of how big a challenge is decommissioning in the offshore space for your industry members.
Senator, it's a normal part of doing business. We've had an industry here in Australia for more than 50 years, and that process of decommissioning is set out at the outset of field development, and it's something that our members are very familiar with, both the international, let's call them global majors, who are responsible for developing and decommissioning fields around the world, and here in Australia. And there are also what we call late life asset specialists who specialise in the later life management of fields and decommissioning. So it is not something that the industry is unfamiliar with, and it's not something that the industry is unable to do. It is a core part of business. It's very well understood, and it's very well accepted that in order to be able to have the privilege to develop Australia's significant resources, that decommissioning is a part of that commitment and privilege.
Leaving aside the levy, what measures have you sought to be included in these bills throughout the consultation process?
Well, Senator, what we've tried to do is make sure that we stay very focused on the purpose of this particular piece of legislation, which is the levy. So our submission has gone only to what we see as needing to change in this particular piece of legislation. And for that, I might ask my colleague Simon Staples to make comment if I could. Thanks, Senator. Simon?
Yeah, certainly, Andrew. So I guess if we go to the points that we raised in our submission, there's a fundamental question about recovering the cost and only the cost. We do have a concern about the period of time that it runs for. So it's scheduled to run for 9 years with some ability to terminate early or vary the rate down. As we put in our submission, we estimate that to recover a minimum of about $3.4 billion. Some sort of back of the envelope calculations that we understand from the inventory that's been provided to us. And I do note that we have not been provided any costing or modelling from Treasury or the departments in relation to the liability they are forecasting. We expect it to be about $1.2 billion. So there is a real concern here that the levy, which is supposed to be designed to collect money associated with recovering the cost of decommissioning and associated remediation of the fields goes far beyond the scope. We also do have a concern around the transparency, so we don't have any visibility on process or cost incurred by the government or how much it's forecast to spend. So we would encourage we would encourage legislation to be to have a reconciliation process that's published annually, so that companies can and see what's being spent and what is being recovered through the levy.
But there's also, from my reading of it, a fair bit of discretion placed on the ability of the minister as well in regards to this. Does that concern APIA as well?
That's correct, Senator. So as you would be aware, regulations or legislative instruments are disallowable instruments. And so there is a concern coming back to the point about the time frame it runs for, that it will run far beyond the time it needed or the costs needed to recover. So hence we're calling for that transparency review to be implemented such that mechanisms can be introduced into law so that you have an automatic termination when all costs have been recovered and the decommissioning activities have been satisfactorily signed off by the department or the government, and such that the rate can be varied where the unrecovered costs are going to be less than what the rate would recover ordinarily.
And just one final one for me. The National Energy Resources Australia report on decommissioning that was released earlier this year said the industry would save $1.5 billion by setting up a decommissioning yard in Australia. Does APIA support establishing such a yard?
I think it does. It's Mr. McConville, Senator. I think it does warrant exploration. I think there is an opportunity for Australia to build specific expertise. That said, we are part of the wider, let's call it, Asian community as well, where there is significant expertise residing in places like Singapore and so on. So it would have to make economic sense. But I do think that it does warrant significant consideration, given the life of fields here in Australia is such that decommissioning will become a more significant part of our operations over the next 20 to 30 years. So yeah, it does warrant consideration.
Thanks, Mr. McConville, and thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Chisholm. Senator Cox, do you have any questions? We've got 3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Yes, just one slightly truncated. Decommissioning is eligible for PRR tax credits that can be transferred across a gas company. Is that correct?
Simon, do you want to take these? Thank you.
Decommissioning in certain aspects, yes, but the credits are only capped at how much you pay. You don't get a full refund if you don't spend the equivalent of what you pay.
Right. So in your opposition to this bill, I want to note that respected gas company credits, says that 60 to 70% of decommissioning costs are borne by taxpayers due to the very generous avoidance of tax credits. Aren't the government effectively paying their lion's share of cleaning up the costs anyway in relation to this levy?
Senator, I think that's 2 different bills. So the concern you raise, as Andrew pointed out earlier, comes back to the broader decommissioning framework and the concerns around whether credits are there or not there. I would observe in that broader decommissioning framework conversation, it is about how you develop a resource in field development from start to finish. I know in previous inquiries we've had conversations about Norway and people paying 78 cents to the dollar. What is often lost in Norway is that you actually get a 78% refund of cash on certain expenditure for exploration. And so the incentive to explore in Norway is then offset by paying higher at the other side. Australia offers a different proposition and different incentives to get the resource out of the ground and provide a broader benefit for the community. With respect to this levy, the proposition is simple cost recovery. How much you spend, how much the government spends is being sought to be recovered from industry through paying 48 cents in the dollar per barrel of oil equivalent.
So, Senator, it's Mr. McConville. Senator, just add, so this bill, as it's drafted, seeks complete cost recovery of all of the costs related to the decommissioning of this field, and there is no tax deductibility proposed under the bill for payments made as part of that levy process.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Mr. McConville. Chair, do I have 1 more minute just to ask one question quickly?
Just one last question, Senator Cox, if you could.
Yes, thank you. Just the final bill was changed from the exposure draft for the definition of decommissioning with the phrase removal of subsea infrastructure. That was removed but updated to read the removal or any other treatment. Is this something that was specifically lobbied for with the government by yourselves?
No, it was not, Senator. We focused on the commercial details of the levy, but what I would say is that when looking at the decommissioning of a field, it is important to consider what is going to deliver the best environmental outcome. And in some instances, the best environmental outcome may be to leave some of those assets in situ. That's an assessment that needs to be made by the regulators. So I think what it was designed to do was to ensure that all of those optionalities are considered to deliver the best environmental outcome. If it was a specific statement that said this was required, then you may actually, by virtue of legislation, be forced to a worse environmental outcome. So the removal of it actually provides the flexibility to ensure that it is fully considered as to what is going to deliver the best outcome.
Great. Thank you very much. That's it, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Cox, and thank you to all of the witnesses from APIA, and thank you for your testimony and also for the submission you've made. It's greatly appreciated. If you'd like to continue watching proceedings, if you could just do it through the parliamentary website after you disconnect from this video conference. Thank you very much. And with that, we will take a short break and we'll reconvene at 2:45. Thank you, everyone. I can, so hopefully everyone's rejoining. Can I just ask before I officially open, the witnesses from the Australia Institute, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Senator.
Oh, thank you.
And
sorry,
my colleague, I just spoke to my colleague who'll be joining us momentarily.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Campbell. All right, so I've got a bit of a preamble, Mr. Campbell, so they'll probably give your colleague a bit of an opportunity to join. I now welcome representatives from the Australia Institute. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings has been provided to witnesses and is available from the Secretariat. Witnesses should speak clearly and into the microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. I'd also like to advise witnesses that answers to any questions on notice should be noted by you today and responses sent to the Secretariat by 4 p.m. Friday, 12 November 2021. There will be no extensions to this timeframe due to the 18 November reporting date. I invite you to make a brief opening statement, Mr. Campbell, should you wish to do so. And for the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
Certainly, my name's Rod Campbell. I'm the Research Director at the Australia Institute. And I'll shortly be joined by Mr. Mark Ogue, Principal Advisor at the Australia Institute. I do have an opening statement, which I've also provided in text to the committee secretariat. I'd like to start by welcoming the opportunity to make a submission to the committee. In considering these bills, it's important to understand the wider economic context of the offshore oil and gas industry. This industry, and particularly its export-oriented projects, provide minimal economic benefit to the Australian community. Oil and gas extraction employs very few Australians, between 25,000 and 30,000 people, according to the ABS, or another way of looking at it is just 2 in every 1,000 workers. This is not an industry that employs very many Australians. Australian Tax Office data shows that the PRRT collections have been declining in recent years, and oil and gas major companies such as Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips and Santos pay minimal company tax, often paying zero in many years. The industry is overwhelmingly foreign owned, meaning that few profits are retained in Australia. Offshore oil and gas companies also receive government assistance, such as the billions committed to ENI's Blacktip project by the NT government, around a $4 billion commitment to that project, or a $60 million subsidy paid to Chevron for its rarely functioning carbon capture and storage scheme at Gorgon. Such subsidies detract from the already meagre economic benefits that the Australian community receives from the offshore oil and gas industry. If we consider climate impacts, it is doubtful that many of these developments even represent a net benefit to the Australian community. If government is to incur further expenses and subsidies for decommissioning, then it is certain that many of these projects come at a net economic cost to the Australian community. This is not just the view of the Australia Institute, I should add. Oil and gas industry figures such as respected analyst Saul Kavonic from Credit Suisse acknowledge that governments often pay subsidies to the oil and gas industry that outweigh payments received. And I quote from his talk at probably a year ago now, his talk at an NT Petroleum Club event. You need to remember that most of the bill for decommissioning is actually borne by the government because it's a PRRT tax credit and it's a corporate tax credit. 60 to 70% actually ends up getting funded by taxpayers. What you've seen in the North Sea, in some years, governments are putting more money into the industry than it is taking out because of decommissioning. That is also going to keep the government a bit wary about being too strict on decommissioning and wanting to keep costs down and spread them out. Given that so much of the cost of decommissioning falls on government, the scale of this decommissioning task needs to be considered. The overall combined liability of the industry has been estimated at $55 billion in Australian dollars, that is, by the government and industry funded Centre of Decommissioning Australia. In considering this estimate, it should be noted that such estimates tend to range. The range of the Northern Endeavour costs has been estimated from between $200 million and $1 billion. Given such a range, it's possible that the overall liabilities for the industry, estimated at $55 billion by CODA, could run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The oil and gas industry is perhaps obviously keen to defer these expenses, and if they can, defer them indefinitely. Returning again to what Saul Kavonic told the NT Petroleum Club, he said, "As many in the audience would know, companies have not really been decommissioning even once the facility comes to the end of its life. They're just mothballing it and ticking it over and pushing it down the road. I would argue that other things being equal, we won't see a mooted decommissioning boom looming. If anything, companies have no appetite for spending decommissioning dollars while the oil price is low." What we're seeing is that wherever possible, sorry, that's the end of that quote. What we're saying is wherever possible, oil and gas companies will try and pass decommissioning costs onto other smaller companies and eventually onto the taxpayer, as the Northern Endeavour debacle has shown. The Department of Industry has acknowledged as much in its consultation on the enhanced offshore oil and gas decommissioning framework, where they said that the industry, and I'm quoting here, the industry continues to mature with large companies may move to divest their mature assets to focus on areas of new production potential. Australia can expect to see new entrants to the industry, smaller companies or joint ventures who bring a fresh perspective and a different risk profile. That's the end of the quote. Fresh perspective and a different risk profile are euphemisms for less reliable companies that will be more likely to transfer risks onto taxpayers, workers, and the environment. It is the risks to the community and the environment that the government and regulators should be focused on minimising, not merely managing. These transitions are not inevitable and in many cases not desirable. To summarise, a huge and expensive task is confronting the offshore oil and gas industry, governments and the public. In essence, these liabilities can be approached one of three ways. Decommissioning costs can either be borne by the entity responsible for each facility, or they could be spread across the wider industry, or they could be borne by the taxpayer. To the Australia Institute, the first option, where each facility bears its own decommissioning costs, or the company that owns it, while that seems the most equitable and economically efficient, the proposed bills and their focus on simply recovering costs from the Northern Endeavour debacle, rather than addressing the wider task at hand, suggests that under this legislation, the wider industry and the taxpayer will be making substantial contributions to this decommissioning task. I'll close by outlining 3 quick recommendations that we might detail more in a written submission that will follow shortly. As our learned friends at APPIA highlighted, there's a real need for improving transparency around the industry and around government management of it, particularly around decommissioning costs. The details of the Northern Endeavour episode were marked as not for publication in the federal budget. This kind of secrecy reduces public confidence in the industry and regulators and limits the public's ability to have input into this policy response. Also, we recommend improving the transparency of how this levy would operate and how much money it might raise. Based on the Department of Industry's long-range forecasts of oil and gas production, we've estimated that it could raise between $300 million and $400 million per year, which, judging from listening to APPIA before us, sounds like we're all in about the same ballpark. But these estimates are dependent on several assumptions that may not hold, particularly given the industry's long-standing reputation for being able to duck out of tax liabilities. And our final recommendation is to involve a range of stakeholders in the oversight of this levy and the wider decommissioning task. One possibility would be using Australia's existing extractive industry transparency initiative and its multi-stakeholder group, which is already set up, has a long track record of meeting and working constructively, despite the government's recent reluctance to use it. So there is a body there that's sitting on the shelf just waiting to be used. And with those recommendations, I'll finish our opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Senator Cox, you've got some questions. You have the call. Senator
thank
Cox?
you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really only one question. In your view, the dates that are set out in this bill for the levy, are they appropriate?
I mean, I think they could be. I think just going back to our point that there's 3 ways of approaching who pays for this. Either the entity responsible for the mess pays for it, the wider industry pays for it, or the taxpayer pays for it. We think the entity responsible should pay for it. And if that was the case, then you'd be wanting to backdate the dates that this is proposed for. My understanding is that as currently written, it goes back to 1 July this year. You'd need to go back a couple of years to ensure that some of the entities involved in the Northern Endeavour project would actually be on the hook for some of that. So I think certainly it should have gone back a little bit earlier. And I guess bigger picture, we're concerned that this narrow focus on this one incident is perhaps blind, if not blinding the committee, certainly narrowing the focus of discussion to one incident, whereas really there is a massive and industry-wide task ahead of us. And so ensuring that this legislation could either be changed or extended to help address some of that wider problem would be really useful in our view.
And I just want to pick up on that point that you've made, Mr. Campbell, that this decommissioning process in Australia will be very complex, very expensive, and span over lots of years, and may introduce many and significant safety and environmental and well integrity risks. So do you think that there's any particular role that government can play in relation to addressing this serious challenge?
There's a huge role for government in overseeing all aspects of it. And I guess, as I've said in our recommendations, I think there's a role for a wide range of stakeholders. I know you've heard from unions and environment groups this morning. And as I've said, we already have a group set up that includes oil and gas companies, mining companies, federal and state bureaucratic representatives, and civil society groups. It's the multi-stakeholder group for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It's well known to the Department of Industry, which has run its secretariat for many years. So absolutely, there's a role for government in overseeing this, and there's also a need to engage with wider stakeholders, and there's a multi-stakeholder group already set up, ready for this task.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Thank you, Chair. That's it from me.
Thank you, Senator Cox. Senator Patrick, you've got the call.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me just grab my sheet here. Post-budget, the oil and gas industry was making statements about this levy being unprecedented, over the top and unfair. Did that surprise you at all?
It didn't surprise me that they would make such a claim, but it also doesn't surprise me that their claim, I think, is pretty disingenuous. I mean, the obvious example is onshore mining activity, where certainly Western Australia has abandoned mines levy that I think at face value has a lot of similar properties. I don't want to get distracted I'm happy to go into, or perhaps I'll notice the details of that. But the idea that it's unprecedented, I think, ignores many years of operation of similar levies relating to mining companies.
Okay, and they seem to have gone quiet a little bit. Any thoughts on the reasoning behind going quiet? Have they had this sort of ethical epiphany, or what's happened?
Yeah, look, I think it is really interesting that this, just from my reading of the website, that this inquiry hasn't received a lot of submissions from industry. And as outlined in our opening statement and the written submission that I'll put in, some of these industry forums have certainly been talking about the need to address this issue. So I guess I'm not an industry insider, but as an outsider, my take would be, I think they're looking at this, they realise there's a massive problem. What's proposed seems pretty affordable and pretty narrowly focused on one area, and maybe the wider industry thinks this is actually a pretty good deal for them, and they're happy to lay quiet and let it go through.
And pay tax for once, maybe.
Well, it's always these things are always better to assess when the ATO data comes out, Senator Patrick. I'll believe it when it's in the ATO data.
Okay, fantastic. Well, actually, that's an interesting point, because do you think this bill will allow this tax to be caught up into tax transparency data that allows people to see what corporate tax is paid and what PRRT tax is paid? Or does that something need to be added to the bill to ensure that this is recorded?
I'm not an expert on drafting bills or tax legislation, but I would urge, I guess we're urging transparency around all aspects of decommissioning and all aspects of the industry, really. You've heard me plugging the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and the need to use it. So I guess I would recommend that the committee find a way or make a recommendation that that level of transparency is achieved, that these payments are easily available to members of the public through something like the ATO's corporate tax transparency release.
Well, one would imagine once the trigger is hit, which is, I think it's $100 million turnover, that the company might actually want this information to be put out into the public domain to show how they're contributing to this particular decommissioning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a dynamic that you see across extractive industries, where large companies that are perhaps making substantial tax payments and that are subject to a lot more scrutiny from taxpayers and regulators. Those kinds of large companies are often keen to highlight their own achievements, their own genuine contributions. And, you know, it has been large companies pushing things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So, you know, I think it highlights the dynamic we're talking about, where are we going to see decommissioning tasks and costs incurred by the whole industry, or spread across the industry where big players pay for the failure of smaller players? Or are we going to really see an effort to make sure everyone pays their own way?
Have you looked at the impact of the potential sale that's taking place in the Bass Strait that would see Woodside taking on responsibility for some of BHP's close to be stranded assets?
I haven't looked in any detail. Mark, have you got anything to add on that?
Sorry, on mute.
Mark.
Sorry, I haven't looked at it in any detail, but I am concerned that given the whole Northern Endeavour debacle, that Woodside would be, take on responsibility for assets that are going to have to be, properly decommissioned over time and will have enormous costs.
Okay, thank you. My final question just goes to the approach here. There clearly is a remedy for Northern Endeavour under a system of responsible management. One might have thought that we might have or seek to have an approach whereby the decommissioning costs were estimated up front, that was transparent, and then a trust arrangement be put in place to make sure that as companies come to the end of their life or end of an operation, they don't simply pack up and leave, or as the case happened with the Northern Endeavour, go into liquidation. Do you have any views on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that would be a better approach. Yes, I would support an approach like that. And, I think we've probably got a bit more background in looking at the way New South Wales approaches its coal mine rehabilitation liabilities, where I think the system's far from perfect. I think it's underfunded and under-regulated, but a broadly similar approach is taken there, and I think that has better potential than what's proposed here.
But what's proposed here is fit for purpose in that we're now dealing with something that has gone into liquidation. It's no longer has a capacity to pay the bill. So in some sense, they are two different things, not necessarily better or worse. But one is a remedy to a particular circumstance. One might be a better way of dealing with the more general circumstance.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Patrick. Just on that last point Senator Patrick made, does the Australia Institute recognise that there was a specific situation that needed to be addressed, and this bill is addressing the specific situation of the Northern Endeavour, where action really is required now, and it's necessary to deal with that issue, that specific issue, rather than try and use this as a measure to deal with all the issues relating to decommissioning. But there's an urgent requirement for this legislation to specifically deal with this issue of the Northern Endeavour.
Yeah, I recognise that that's one way of looking at it, but the Northern Endeavour is, just one example. That we would have such a disaster so early in Australia's decommissioning task, I think, sets the scene for perhaps many more. And again, if we look on land, Australia's got. Australia has around 60,000 abandoned mine sites. So companies doing a runner on extractive companies doing a runner on their rehabilitation liabilities isn't something new. We've got a centuries-long history of this. And so while there's definitely a need to address the Northern Endeavour situation, I really think government needs to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think the decommissioning framework that's been consulted on is a positive move. I guess I'd just like to see more being done, more transparency around what is being done, and a wider recognition of the size of the task, and the need to engage widely on and take the task really seriously. Sorry, I think you're on mute, Senator.
Thank you for your testimony today. If you'd like to continue to listen to the proceedings, you're invited to go onto the parliamentary website and watch the proceedings through there. But I would ask you if you could disconnect from the video conference, and we'll move on to our next witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, committee.
So everyone, we'll just stand by and wait for our next witnesses to join us.
Can you hear us from NOPSEMA?
Yeah, we can't hear them.
Chair, you got Paul Trotman here from the Department of Industry.
And you've got Stuart Smith and Carl Hayden from NOPSEMA here as well. Need IT.
I think you're on mute, Chair.
Yep, can you hear me now?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. So I now welcome representatives from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources and the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority, NOPSEMA. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings has been provided to witnesses and is available from the Secretariat. I remind officials that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state or territory shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Witnesses should speak clearly and into the microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. I would also like to advise witnesses that answers to any questions on notice should be noted by you today and responses sent to the Secretariat by 4 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, Friday, 12 November 2021. There will be no extensions this time frame due to the 18 November reporting date. I invite each of the department and NOPSEMA to make any opening statements you have. If I could go to the department first, Mr. Trotman, do you have an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair. I've got a brief opening statement.
Okay, please proceed.
So my name's Paul Trotman. I head the Resources Division within the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. Appearing with me from the department is Mr. Shane Gaddez, Head of the Liquid Fuels and Northern Endeavour Division, and Ms. Mari Illman, General Manager of the Offshore Resources Branch. As senators may be aware, on the 7th of February 2020, Timor Sea Oil and Gas Proprietary Limited, Northern Oil and Gas Australia Proprietary Limited, and Toga Services Proprietary Limited, collectively referred to as the Nova Group of companies, was placed into liquidation. In the absence of a commercial or an industry-led solution, the government acted quickly to ensure the Northern Endeavour floating petroleum storage and offtake facility was not abandoned. The Northern Endeavour Task Force was established to manage the operation and maintenance of the Northern Endeavour and investigate options for the future of the facility. In December 2020, the government decided that the Northern Endeavour FPSO would be decommissioned and the associated oil fields would be remediated. And this was seen as the most cost-effective way to remove potential risks and to ensure protection of the environment. The decommissioning of the Northern Endeavour facility and the remediation of the Laminaria Corallina fields is one of the first major decommissioning projects in Australian waters. Government has always maintained that decommissioning remains the responsibility of industry and that taxpayers would not be out of pocket for this decommissioning project. Australia is a stable investment regime for petroleum investors in large part due to the public acceptance of oil and gas extraction activities, and the extraordinary circumstances led to the government stepping in on this occasion. In the meantime, an increasing number of Australian projects are approaching decommissioning activities in the coming decades, and as such, the Parliament passed legislation in August to enhance the offshore oil and gas decommissioning framework. The changes enhance the government's oversight and scrutiny of a range of company transactions to ensure that entities that want to operate in the oil and gas industry are suitable and have the financial resources and technical capability to operate and decommission safely. The changes also expand the government's ability to call on a previous title holder to pay for decommissioning and environmental remediation if they sell a title and the new title holder is then unable to meet their financial obligations. The government is committed to introducing a temporary levy on offshore petroleum production to recoup the Commonwealth's costs associated with the decommissioning and remediation of the Laminaria Corallina oil fields and associated infrastructure. The Treasury is the responsible agency for the preparation of the two bills that are currently before the Parliament and are subject to this hearing. The Department supported the Treasury by conducting stakeholder consultation and providing technical advice on Australia's offshore oil and gas regulatory framework. And as part of the consultation undertaken by the Department and Treasury, it was made clear that the levy would commence on 1 July 2021. The levy will apply at a rate of 48 cents per barrel of oil equivalent produced as measured at the wellhead. And all entities with an ownership interest in a petroleum production licence issued under the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act 2006 will be liable for the levy. The levy will apply at the title holder entity level, with all members of a joint venture individually liable in proportion to their interest. The JV lead will be responsible for providing sufficient information to its partners to enable each entity to calculate its respective liability. And where an entity is entitled to petroleum produced from more than one project, the entity will make one levy payment to cover all of its interests for the year. The levy will be paid on an annual basis in arrears, and the first payments for the 2021-2022 financial year will be payable in the first half of 2022-2023. The Department considers that the proposed legislation will achieve the government's policy intent to decommission the Laminaria and Corallina fields and the associated infrastructure at no cost to the taxpayer, operate with minimum administrative burden on the industry, align with the Commonwealth's procurement framework, and minimise the risk of over-collecting from industry. So thank you again for the opportunity to provide an opening statement. Officers from my department very much welcome questions from the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Trotman. Does NOPSEMA have an opening statement just before we open up to questions?
No, Chair, I think the comments made by Mr. Trotman would cover anything that we would raise, so I think we can go straight to questions.
Okay, I'll give the call to Senator Patrick, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just in relation to the level, Mr. Trotman, the levy, Mr. Trotman, will the levy cover the cost of Northern Endeavour operating in lighthouse mode? So, you know, where the decommissioning hasn't technically commenced.
Yes, that's correct, Senator.
Okay, will it cover the cost of the legal proceedings currently underway in the New South Wales Supreme Court?
As far
whichever way it falls.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, yes, Senator.
Okay. What about cost of finance? Noting that the taxpayers borne the cost of this for probably at least 12, be 24 months before a payment comes in?
It might be better if that question is addressed to the Treasury officials that will be appearing after us, Senator.
Okay, thank you. That's I appreciate that's a technical question.
Yeah, well, just to clarify, Senator, in terms of cost of finance, what do you actually mean?
Well, there's an interest cost, a deficit cost that is paid by the taxpayer for its money that it contributes to these sorts of things. So that's a at a commercial level, one would, if one had to borrow money to pay for something, there's a cost associated with the financing of that.
Okay, no, thank you. Yeah, I think probably that's best addressed by the Treasury.
Right, perfect. Thank you. How much resources left in the two fields? Actually, I'm sorry, I might just go back. Just the bill itself is a bit ambiguous on when the levy will actually it says it's going to stop in 29/30, but it could stop beforehand by way of a legislative instrument. How was it determined initially that 2029/30 would be an appropriate number to use?
I think again, those questions are probably addressed by the Treasury. They were in the lead in terms of developing the legislation.
All right, thank you. Going back to the fields, how much resources are left in the field? As obviously that's has played a part in the decision not to try and continue to exploit the field versus decommissioning. And this, in some sense, goes to the questions asked with estimates about methods for improving the collection in the ore body, as Senator Scarr described it.
I might just ask my colleague, Mr. Shane Gaddis, to address that. We'll just do a bit of a slide down the table, Senator, won't you?
Thank you, Senator. Shane Gaddis, head of the Liquid Fuels and Northern Endeavour Division. I don't have that answer to hand, but I think we took on notice your request to get the Gaffney-Klein report at the last estimates hearing. We are currently pulling together that material. So I'd say that given that we took it on notice at the previous committee, we will take that one on notice at this one as well, because it's the material that's in the Gaffney-Klein and UPS work. It's the same material.
Well, in that case, the requirement to answer questions on notice is sooner for this committee. So I'll just point that out to you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. But I'm happy for it to be the same question.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay, in terms of Timor-Leste, was any consideration given to transferring the tenements in to Timor-Leste?
Just bear with me, Senator. We'll just figure out who's the best person to answer that question.
Senator Paul Trotman. So there are a number of decisions that the government undertook as part of this exercise and a number of considerations, but I might have to take that on notice in terms of whether the government actively looked at a Timor-Leste option.
Yeah, it might be Ms. Schofield has the details on that. I think she's transferred across to health. These fields will eventually be located on the Timor side of the line, won't they? Is that how it works?
Senator, I might just ask my expert in these matters, Ms. Mari Ellman, who heads up the Offshore Resources branch.
Thank you.
That question.
Good afternoon, Senator. Mari Ellman, General Manager of the Offshore Resources branch. Your question relates to whether the Lamcor fields will transition over to the Timor-Leste side of the boundary.
That's correct.
There are two conditions in the treaty between Australia and Timor-Leste for that situation to occur. The commercial depletion of the fields, the Lamcor fields, and the delimitation of maritime boundaries between Indonesia and Timor-Leste. The timing of that set of activities is a matter for the countries, Timor-Leste and Indonesia. So the treaty with Timor-Leste provides for those two conditions to be met for that transition to occur.
So I'm just trying to tie in all those questions I've asked here about how much is left in the field, and whether there's opportunity for Timor-Leste to potentially take it or could have taken advantage of this, or perhaps could still, depending on what is meant by decommissioning into the future.
Understood. That the matter of the fields was part of the negotiations between the countries, and the Maritime Boundary Treaty that was settled reflects the positions of the countries that was reached during the negotiations.
All right, thank you. Now, this might be Mr. Trotman, I'm not sure, but just wondering, in relation to the consultation, the department opened up consultation on the 14th of December through to the 22nd of January. So it's a relatively short time period, and obviously a difficult time for most organisations to resource responding to consultation. How many submissions did you receive in relation to that consultation?
Senator, can I just clarify that question? Is that in relation to the decommissioning policy framework, or is
That's correct.
The bill for the LAMCOR levy?
No, the decommissioning framework consultation.
Okay. All right. So the consultation period was from the 14th of December to the 22nd of January. And if I just go through my folder, I will find 29 submissions were received.
Possibly you provide a list of those who made submissions, please.
I'll come back to you on that one, Senator. They were marked as confidential as part of the consultation process, but I can certainly.
Yeah, sure. I'm not asking for the content of them, just who took advantage of that opportunity. Did you actually reach out to any potential stakeholders, or is it just gazetted?
You mean through the for the decommissioning framework?
Framework, yeah.
So I could step back if I may. We actually ran 2 rounds of consultation. We did an initial consultation paper and ran a series of workshops through 2019 and 2020. And then we released the enhanced decommissioning framework over that period we just discussed, and took a second round of submissions. And then with those submissions, the questions we asked, particularly related to trailing liability, changes of control, modernising field development plans, improving transparency around planning for decommissioning, and the way that could best be reflected in the regulatory framework. So those submissions were the ones that we took over that period, and were used to inform the development of the bill, which went through Parliament recently.
Okay. So just to get my understanding correctly, obviously that decommissioning framework is looking across a much larger problem space, but you're saying that that also fed into this bill, which is for a specific case, or is there some other consultation that also fed into this particular bill?
There were separate consultation processes. There was the Titles Administration and Other Measures Bill, which passed through the House and the Senate middle of the year. And then there is this separate bill, which this committee is convened for the purpose of the levy. So it's separate consultations.
Okay, and what submissions did you receive in relation to the consultation specifically for this bill?
That's where I will pass to Mr. Trotman.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Senator, we was sliding down the...
You're making us all dizzy. But
no, we had a last-minute IT issue here, so apologies for the other members of the committee. So we consulted with APIA initially and provided a paper for distribution to its members on the 4th of June. And we subsequently released that paper more broadly on the 24th of June via the department's website. And Minister Pitt also wrote to a range of domestic and international stakeholders to highlight the process. So on the 23rd of June and the 13th of July, the department, as well as the Treasury officials, held meetings with APIA and its member companies. And we also conducted ad hoc consultation with non-APIA member companies on an as-needed basis.
Okay, was any paper prepared as a result of that consultation?
There was a paper that was prepared as ahead of the consultation, and that's a discussion paper that's on the department's website. We can organise to get a copy of that to you.
I was wondering about after.
No, I'm not aware of a paper that was prepared after.
Okay, can I ask about the decommissioning framework consultation as well? Obviously, that was a broader consultation. My question, the same question, was a report prepared as in response to that particular consultation?
Might have to be ready to get dizzy again. Sorry, Senator. I'll sort of have Ari on.
It's my last question, so.
Might be a moment.
Hi there, Senator. So in terms of was a paper prepared following the enhanced framework, the short answer is no, but what we did produce was the exposure draft of the legislation and the bill that went into the Parliament, plus we have a range of other pieces of work which we are progressing. Our priority was the progression of the legislation which implemented the trailing liability provisions. Senator, you may be aware, but we've also released for consultation a set of 8 guidance materials which support those provisions in the legislation and their implementation. They're currently up on our website for industry to get familiar with the contents of the new material and the new legislation before it comes into effect on 2 March next year.
Okay, thank you. I might hand off, Chair, but I might come back with another question. I just want to go back and check my notes from the previous witnesses.
Okay, thank you, Senator Patrick. Senator Chisholm, you have the call.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to get a sense of the department about what the decommissioning cost to the government is so far. How much money have you incurred on this?
Senator, I will move out and let Mr. Geddes take the chair for that one.
Thank you, Senator. Could you just repeat the question for me? That's the revolving windows that we've got going on here is a bit hard to follow.
Sorry, what is the decommissioning cost the government has so far incurred?
So, Senator, as at the 31st of August, the total administrative expenditure for the department is $148 million, roughly.
Yeah. And you say you classify that as administrative costs, was that correct?
Yeah, so that's the costs that the department pays to external parties, Senator.
And will that $148 million be recovered as part of the levy?
My understanding is that is a yes, Senator.
How did the department establish the 48 cents per barrel as the appropriate value?
So, Senator, I'll have to pass to my policy colleagues again now because that's not something that I can offer. Perhaps before I move, to make the committee's life a little bit easier, if you had any more questions around the operations aspect of the decommissioning, I could answer those now, and you could then group up the questions around the policy, around the levy, and ask my colleagues.
I do have a couple in that space. I've realised that it was related to something the unions had said, but I'll let the chair's hand whether I can ask them now.
Well, I'll first, Senator Chisholm currently has the call. Senator Chisholm, do you have any other questions on the operational matters so the witnesses can deal with those issues first, or would you like to go through all of your questions in the first instance?
I was going to move to some other issues. I've sort of got 2 lots of notes going on here. I was going to move to some other questions to NOPSEMA directly.
Well, look, Senator Patrick, I might let Senator Chisholm finish his line of questions first, if I can, so he's got an opportunity to ask his questions, and then we'll see how we're going in terms of time. So, Senator Chisholm, you've got the call.
Senator, it's Paul Trotman, Head of Resources Division. So The Treasury led on the formulation of the parameters of the levy. So that question is probably best asked of the Treasury.
Okay. Does your department have an estimate of how much will be collected from the levy? How much money will be collected from the levy?
As we've said in our submission to this inquiry, that the levy will collect the appropriate amount of money to fund all of the decommissioning costs. So at this point in time, we don't have a precise figure because, as you can appreciate, we are currently undertaking a global procurement exercise. And as part of that, it would be very difficult for us to put a number out there in the public realm, because it would potentially jeopardise the ability for the government to get best value for money if a figure was out there. But there has been lots of speculation in the media around what the costs of the total levy might be.
Okay. Is there a reason why the levy does not terminate automatically once the stated objective of recovering the Commonwealth costs of decommissioning and remediating the gas fields?
Goes, Senator, to partly to that answer that I provided, that because we don't have the final cost for the total remediation and decommissioning, we will establish a review process on a year-on-year basis, and so that the Minister for Resources will be able to decide whether, based on advice from the Tax Commissioner, whether the levy has covered all the costs of the decommissioning and remediation, and each year by legislative instrument, the Minister will make a determination for the levy to either finish or be extended. Again, like in a year where the Minister considers that all the costs have been recovered, the rate could be adjusted to nil, and then the levy would be terminated, and that again would be by legislative instrument.
Just some questions for NOPSEMA. What safety or environmental concerns have arisen about the vessel since it has been run by the Northern Endeavour Task Force? And of those issues, how have they been dealt with?
Thank you, Senator. I'll hand over to Mr. Hayden to answer that one.
Thank you, Senator. We keep, I guess, a close watch on the way the facility is being managed by the Northern Endeavour Task Force, and we get notifications of incidents that might arise as per normal regulatory processes, the types of incidents that get notified to us. And we provide information to the task force around what those notifications are and when we receive them. Would be fair to say that there's not been an untoward number of incidents that get notified to us as per other normal operating facilities, but there are incidents that we do get notified of. And when we do get notification of them, we then determine whether we need to undertake an inspection of the particular issue or follow up on the remedial action that might have been undertaken by the task force and their contractor UPS.
How many directions and prohibition notices have been issued to upstream production services?
In relation to the Northern Endeavour since the liquidation? None.
Yeah.
We're not able to.
Okay, so that's what I was going to get to next. So under the current legal arrangements, are you allowed to issue a direction or prohibition notice to UPS?
It's not so much whether we're allowed. We don't have the regulatory remit to do so because they are not an operator or a title holder under the offshore petroleum legislation.
Okay. So could you issue a fine?
No.
Could you issue a fine to a diving contractor working under the Northern Endeavour?
We can only issue enforcement action where the organisation undertaking the action is either a title holder or a registered operator. Under the current arrangements for the Northern Endeavour, neither of those two criteria are met.
Okay. Can you estimate how many disused oil and gas wells there are around the Australian coast?
I'm not in a position to answer that off the top of my head. We can take that on notice.
Okay. In directions you have issued to other oil and gas companies about their disused facilities, NOPSEMA directs them to plug or close off to the satisfaction of NOPSEMA all wells. Can you describe the risks of these wells and what are you looking for here to satisfy that the wells are safe? So, for instance, how can you establish the work has been completed to your satisfaction?
Talk to us, Stuart.
So before we would agree to the surrender of a title or provide advice to NOPTA on surrender of a title, we would be monitoring the wells that are proposed to have been or are proposed to be abandoned. So it would be the information provided by the company that we would then consider whether an inspection is warranted and whether the information is sufficient for us to accept that the risk has been removed.
Okay. In these same directions, you direct them to provide to the satisfaction of NOPSEMA for the conservation and protection of natural resources in the tidal area. Can you describe what you're looking for here and how you establish that work is satisfactory?
Yeah, do you mean in regard to wells particularly, Senator?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the tidal area as well.
Yes. Yeah, so in terms of wells, what we're looking for is to ensure that measures have been put in place to ensure that there isn't going to be any leakage or issues related to the wells now or into the future, such that the government is prepared to accept surrender of the title without risk being transferred from the title holder to the taxpayer.
In these same directions, you direct them to make good to the satisfaction of NOPSEMA any damage to the seabed or subsoil in the tidal area caused by any person engaged or concerned in those operations. So that's oil and gas. Can you describe what you are looking for here and how you establish the work is satisfactory?
Yeah, the obligation on the companies under the Act is to remove all the equipment and restore the site back to its original state. There is provision under the regulations for some discretion to be exercised if there's net environmental benefit from allowing some things to remain in situ, but that's determined on a case-by-case basis. So putting that to one side, the base case is full removal and restoration of the site back to its original state. So that's what we're seeking.
Thanks. I just had a couple of questions for the department again, sorry. The bill introduces a new definition of decommissioning. However, the current Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act does not use this term and instead requires removal. NOPSEMA policy follows this act and companies must apply for and justify any deviation from removal requirements. Why is the new term being used in this act?
It's in relation to the bill. No, it's not. Senator, I can answer the question in relation to the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act. The current legislation has a broader conceptualisation than just decommissioning. The Act has a remediation of the environment and removal and maintenance of property. It conceptualises those two things, and decommissioning is a petroleum activity which contributes to the achievement of those two objectives.
So that doesn't explain why there's a new term being used in this act that we're discussing today.
Decommissioning is a readily acceptable term in the industry, and it is conceptualised as a petroleum activity under the current regulatory framework in Australia. So it may not be referred to directly, but it is under the broader conceptualisation of a petroleum activity, under the broader conceptualisation of remediation of the environment and removal of property. I think
Treasury,
more modern terminology, if you like.
Treasury published an exposure draft of this bill in September, and the definition of decommissioning included the phrase removal of subsea infrastructure. In the version before Parliament, this has been updated to read removal or any other treatment. When was this added and why?
Senator, it's Paul Trotman, Head of Resources Division. I think that question is probably best asked of Treasury. We aren't aware of the answer to that.
Okay. In the tender for towing away the Northern Endeavour issued in July, the department said the work should set the standard for future similar activities in Australian waters. What specific measures is the department looking for with this phrase?
Senator Shane Gaddis, again, Head of Liquid Fuels Northern Endeavour Division. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to answer that question now because that procurement process is still underway. If I was to give you that answer, it would be giving guidance to those people that are currently putting together their request for proposal. And I don't want to be in a situation where I do that.
Okay, well, how about this then? What measures are in the bill to ensure that this is the case? So what measures are in the bill that ensure that this is going to set the standard for future similar activities in Australian waters?
Senator Paul Trotman, Head of Resources. The context of this bill is more around the quantum of the levy and that the levy will pay for the full costs of the decommissioning. In terms of going to what you ask around the standard, as Mr. Gaddis mentioned, that's subject to the procurement exercise that's currently underway. Suffice to say, though, that the government expects high standards in the delivery of the decommissioning and the remediation of subsea infrastructure.
Chair, just make the point that during a procurement process, it is possible for the department to answer a question here and simply then go out on its procurement portal to those that are participating in the tender. So giving the Senate information doesn't disadvantage any particular tender if they follow that process.
Sorry, it's just the chair here. Thanks for that point, Senator Patrick. Senator Chisholm, are you happy for the department just to answer Senator Patrick's point before you continue with the call?
Sure.
Well, it just goes to not answering Senator Chisholm's question. You can simply put an answer on the table here and then go straight to your procurement portal and just write the words, the Senate asked these questions, we advise this answer, and then everyone, there are no probity issues with that. That's the normal process. If someone else asks a question about a procurement process that they're involved in, the answer is simply made and given to every participant.
Perhaps, Chair, if I could reframe the question without getting into the specifics.
If you could, please.
So I suppose that's sending a strong signal to those proponents that wanted to put in an expression of interest that the government is looking at best oil field practice, and it goes to a signal to industry that we're not looking to cut corners here. We're looking to set a standard for others to follow. That includes meeting all of the requirements set out by NOPSEMA in their ordinary processes. We've already been through the fact that NOPSEMA doesn't have a strict regulatory role here, but one in which we're seeking to emulate the regulatory standards through the contractual provisions for the provider. So it's sending a signal to the market that we're looking for the highest standard of decommissioning here, not the cheapest.
Thank you.
Senator Chisholm, you've got the call.
Just a couple of final questions from me. Can you describe the legal processes as put in place since the title holder for the Northern Endeavour went bankrupt? Who is responsible for safety and environmental compliance on the facility? and the associated wells and oil fields? And what legislation covers the vessel and the oil fields at the moment?
Just bear with me, Senator, while I find the correct brief, because that one's legally it's a bit challenging to answer. One of the issues associated with there being no title holder for the Northern Endeavour is that the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act no longer applies. So we are seeking to emulate that regulatory framework through the contractual position with upstream production services. So as a part of that, we have a deed of standing offer with NOPSEMA. They provide advice on the activities around the Northern Endeavour, and we expect that UPS, or Upstream Production Services, conducts their activities in accordance with the previously accepted safety case. It's not their activities can't be inconsistent with the accepted well operations management plan and the environment plan, and we also expect them to operate consistent with good oil field practice.
Okay, I don't think you quite answered what legal processes have been put in place since the Northern Endeavour went bankrupt.
Senator, we enforce those through the contract we have with the provider on the vessel, Upstream Production Services. So there's no regulatory framework on legislation. We enforce it through the contract.
Right. Just one final one from me. Who will write the plan for the well plugging, removal and remediation work to be carried out on the oil fields? And how will this be scrutinised and approved?
So, Senator, the successful proponent through the procurement process will be responsible for those activities. It will go through the emulated regulatory framework with NOPSEMA that I just spoke about. So NOPSEMA will still go through and assess it as they would in a normal process. They will provide feedback, and perhaps my NOPSEMA colleagues can talk to this a bit more. And then when there will be an emulated acceptance process, and then the proponent will be expected to implement that plan.
Senator, it's Stuart Smith here, CEO of NOPSEMA. Just to follow on the comments from Mr. Gaddies, I can confirm that that's our understanding as well. The successful tenderer will put together the necessary documents that they would ordinarily under the OPGGSA. We expect they'll be provided to us, and we will go through our normal processes to assess whether they meet the requirements of the OPGGSA, and then we'll provide advice back to the Northern Endeavour Task Force on our views as though it was a regulated entity.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Chisholm. I just before we go to Senator Cox, I've just got some questions on the health and safety aspects, and I'm from the mining industry originally, so that's the context in which I tend to look at these things, and health and safety is absolutely the number one priority for any operation, whatever operation it is. It seems to me, and this question's addressed to the department, you're trying to replicate the impact of having a regulator or the role of a regulator through the contractual provisions with the service providers. So there is a distinction between imposing an obligation on someone through a contract, a contractual obligation, as opposed to a regulator who has legal authority and can issue directions under law, which are legally binding and which have a number of sanctions, might be criminal sanctions and might be civil penalty sanctions under that legislation for breach in terms of health and safety. I'm just interested in the department's view as to how you make sure you really do emphasise, if you like, or give the structure which you're proposing to introduce the same effect in practice that having someone like NOPSEMA having jurisdiction has in practice? How comfortable are you that the contracts that you're going to enter into are going to practically replicate the impact of someone like NOPSEMA being able to issue directions under force of legislation, etc.?
Sorry, Chair. I think if I could answer that question without giving you an opinion, I'll perhaps try to do it that way. I mean,
Yeah, I'm not seeking an opinion on policy. I'm more interested in how is this going to work in practice to make sure that the contractors, and you're engaging in a global procurement process, to make sure that the contractors operate to the highest health and safety standards.
So, in terms of process, how we're assuring ourselves that they are doing that, Chair, is that we're doing it through the normal NOPSEMA inspections that you would undertake. There are a range of Lloyd's class inspections that need to be undertaken as well to ensure the vessel is in class. We're adding an extra level of assurance by having our own inspections undertaken by a member of the task force, seconded from NOPSEMA, working directly for us in these instances, to assure us that the relevant standards under the contract are met. So I can't tell you in terms of what my views are on that, but I can tell you what we're doing to assure ourselves that those standards are being met.
But it's fair to say the department recognises the crucial importance of practically making sure that whatever it does in terms of managing this contract, managing the delivery of these services, that as far as practical, you replicate the impact of having a regulator such as NOPSEMA engaging in inspections and directions. Is that a fair comment?
We do, and I can say this very, very comfortably. We are very closely aligned with NOPSEMA. We have very regular meetings with any incident reports that come to us. It's fair to say we're very well joined at the hip on this to make sure that we get advice from the relevant people in NOPSEMA, have NOPSEMA people embedded within our teams to ensure that we're meeting the best oil field practice that we can and safety standards.
And just one further collateral question, if you like, to that before I go to Senator Cox, and that is this. In the usual decommissioning or closing of a mine or underground oil well, whatever, you've got a dynamic in which the title holder has the responsibility to complete that work. They go out, hire a contractor. They're responsible for that contractor's performance. Obviously, they have a very great motivation to make sure that the contractor does what they say they're going to do, but also they do it on a cost-effective basis, and they do it efficiently. And you've got a tension in the process insofar as the regulators there inspecting the work done can point out any issues. But as a product of that tension between the regulator and the title holder and the contractor, hopefully you get the desired result. In this case, the work is being funded through a levy generally across the industry, and you're going through this procurement process. Again, and I'm sure the answer is you have, but if you can give me any insight into the thoughts the department has in terms of how you're going to keep the contractor honest, if you like, to make sure that they're just not using this as a money-generating exercise, but they're actually progressing as efficiently, safely, and as environmentally responsibly as possible.
That's a very good question, Chair, and one that we are constantly considering when we have obligations under the PGPA Act to ensure that we are not spending any more of the taxpayers' dollars than is reasonable in the circumstances. In terms of a few things about the process that we will undertake to ensure that we're not wasting taxpayers' dollars or dollars that are recovered through the levy in this instance, we've got a range of independent experts that we hire. They allow us to benchmark the costs for certain things. Obviously, we will have a pretty good handle on what things will cost when we finish our expression of interest and request for proposal process as well. And by buying in that expertise from the oil and gas industry, former regulators, those sorts of things, we use all of these things to assure ourselves that we are getting value for money.
Okay, so independent experts will play a key part in terms of managing the performance of the contract and keeping it on track, yeah?
Exactly.
Okay, excellent. Senator Cox, you've got the call.
Thank you. Quickly, just confirming that the department did seek a EBBCA approval for the cleanup.
Senator, we have held 2 exemptions under the EPBC Act, Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999. The first one ends at the end of this calendar year, and that was for lighthouse operations. So obviously when you take over a project like this, you didn't have the long lead time that most proponents would have to get their regulatory approvals in place, because we didn't. It's not a project that's being put forward by the Commonwealth, the one that they've taken over. So we now have an exemption for lighthouse operations. The Minister for Environment recently approved a second exemption for that one until the end of 2022. That one is slightly different in makeup. It allows for limited injection of wells that we might need to do in an emergency or as part of decommissioning. That covers the lighthouse activities and the activities that we have underway at the moment. The full decommissioning will be subject to a referral under the EPBC Act to ensure that we're fully within that regulatory framework for the decommissioning proper.
Right. How will the government measure when the removal and remediation are complete? And is this being done through an independent assessment process?
It's probably too early, Senator, for us to determine that. Any approvals that we would be operating under, for example, the environment plan, the well operations management plan from NOPSEMA, and also any conditions that are attached to the EPBC Act approval by the Environment Minister will guide when we are finished decommissioning. So it's too early for us to tell what conditions the regulators will apply and when those conditions will be met.
Okay, in July 2021, the department sought tenders to tow away Northern Endeavour and the project and said it will set standards for future similar activities in Australian waters. Can you tell us about the tender for the cleanup, and will it all be done in Australia to create Australian jobs, or will it be done overseas?
I can't tell you the outcome of that process, and I can give you an update on the process. So we put out an expression of interest for that process in July. We have now down selected to a number of preferred tenderers, and we put out a request for proposal to that down selected number of tenderers. That response to that request for more detailed request for proposal is due tomorrow, and then we will evaluate those processes and select the preferred tenderer. So I can't tell you what that looks like until we've finished that process.
Right. And has the department considered, or will it consider making publicly available reports on the status of the decommissioning project?
Again, Senator, this one's a bit tricky as well. We are subject to litigation in the New South Wales Supreme Court with a secured creditor of the former Noga group of properties. So we can't really put out information on the condition of the FPSO or any of those types of things until that litigation has been resolved.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've got some questions for NOPSEMA. Has the net zero by 2050 modelling released by the International Energy Agency this year been used to inform any risk assessments of Australia's offshore oil and gas operators' capacity to undertake full decommissioning?
In regard to the Northern Endeavour, Senator?
In regard to all of them. But you can talk about that one, I think.
Well, yes, Senator, we have regard to Scope 3 emissions, if that's the question you're asking.
Well, it's the net zero by 2050 modelling that was around informing any of the risk assessments.
Yes, Senator, we have regard to all relevant environmental impacts when we're making our environmental approvals decisions.
Right. And what do you estimate the total cost of these future liabilities to be?
We don't estimate the total cost, Senator.
So there's not a monetary figure attached to that? Is that what you're telling me?
Oh, I'm telling you that we don't come up with a figure, no, Senator.
Right. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Sorry, I do have one more question just quickly for the department. How much time have we got, Chair?
Nicole, you've got time for one more question.
Oh, thank you. You're so kind. The government paid $9 million to Woodside, the original owners of the abandoned site, for expert advice. What information was secured through this advice?
So, Senator, at the stage that the government took over the FPSO and started to manage the process, they needed to form a view about whether or not there was scope to restart production at the facility or whether to decommission the facility. This is an issue that's been well canvassed in this committee previously. As a part of that, they paid the former operator to provide a scoping study on the cost of decommissioning. The government also went through and provided advice from upstream production services around the economic viability of restarting production, and they had both of those pieces of work peer reviewed by Gaffney Klein. That information went to government before government made a decision that the safest and most efficient way to deal with the FPSO and the fields were to decommission them with a levy.
So just a clarifying question on that. That is the former operator?
Once removed, Senator, so Woodside was before the Noga group of properties. So they were not the operator that was in charge at the time that the companies went into liquidation.
Right. Still, my procurement background tells me that there might have been a conflict of interest in that. Were there any discussions internally through this procuring advice that you were financially rewarding a company that pushed millions of dollars into remediation costs onto the taxpayer?
I'd have to take that one on notice, Senator.
You can take that one on notice. Can you see how the taxpayer might be, well, the word disgusted has been used, that they effectively paid Woodside, that they have profited from abandoning the Northern Endeavour well?
Could you repeat the question, Senator? It sounds like you're asking for an opinion.
No, it's a question. Can you see how they might be discussed with the taxpayer?
But Senator Cox,
The
you
procurement
are
process.
entitled to ask questions, but you're not entitled to, or the witnesses, these witnesses shouldn't be placed in a position where they need to comment on government policy. So we just need to be mindful of that, not placing them in a position where they're the ones who have to account for government policy. Thank you.
Happy to take that on notice.
Okay, thank you. Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Senator Cox. Senator Patrick, I just want to give you one final opportunity. Have all the questions you want to raise, have they all been covered now?
Some of them have, but I've just got a couple of quick ones.
Okay, if you could
thank
be
you. Thank you
reasonably
very
quick.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you? This is to Mr. Geddes. Can you please just table the request for proposal that went out to all of the company? Well, it went out to a select group of the companies, just for us to understand the scope of what was asked of the down selected participants.
If you wouldn't mind, Senator, before I agree to do that, I'll just take that on notice and seek some advice on whether or not that's appropriate and when would be appropriate to do that.
Sure. One would think if you're prepared to share it with multiple companies, then and no one else can participate in the program, that information ought to be made public. But happy for you to take that on notice. Just going back to a couple of questions about UPS's operation. You might have heard me ask the unions about the fact that the cost for UPS to operate the Northern Endeavour in lighthouse mode appears to be more than what was being paid to operate in production mode. And then on top of that, there appears on the evidence that was provided by the unions today to be some, well, it just seemed like concerns that actually UPS were not particularly taking care of their workers particularly well, might be cutting corners and so forth. Maybe if you want to take it on notice, just to come back. And I know it's no longer value for money for the taxpayer. It's now value for money, assuming this legislation passes for the industry. But we have to. I think we've got to be fair in relation to that. Just it seems it's hard to reconcile the costs being paid now to UPS versus what was being paid before, particularly knowing the circumstances that the unions described.
Senator, if perhaps it might help us if you could provide the evidence that you have that there is a difference in cost. You may have information that we don't have available to us in answering that.
I simply went and had a look at the KPMG costs. Look, I'd be happy to come back through the Minister's office to give you how we reached that, but it appeared, looking at the administrator's report, that which spelled out costs, UPS's costs were much less, or about half the price, is my understanding. And you would understand why I might ask that question.
Oh, I think it's. I could understand why you would ask it, Senator. It may be as simple as that the scopes of work are vastly different.
Sure.
There's a range of activities on board now in terms of decommissioning readiness that weren't underway then. But perhaps the best way would be for me to take it on notice and we can come back with a more fulsome answer.
All right, that sounds fair. And can I just also put on the record, I know Senator Chisholm wasn't being malicious when he said this, but the Northern Endeavour owner, which was Noga, actually went into voluntary administration, which then turned into a liquidation, or effectively shutting down the operation. I think it's just to be fair to the operator, or to the previous owner. And that's correct, isn't it, Mr. Geddes?
That is correct. They went into voluntary administration, and then the administrators, I think, put them into liquidation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Patrick. And can I thank the witnesses from the department and also the witnesses from NOPSEMA for your appearance today. It's greatly appreciated. I'd ask you to now disconnect from the video conference or teleconference, but you can continue to watch the hearing should you wish to do so through the live stream on Parliament's website. And thank you for appearing today. So I would now like to welcome representatives from the Department of the Treasury. So if I can ask the witnesses from the Department of Treasury who are appearing before us today. I think we have the witnesses here, yep. So I'm just going to read a short blurb and then give you an opportunity to make an opening statement if you would like to do so. So thank you for appearing before the committee today. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings has been provided to witnesses and is available from the Secretariat. I remind officials that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state or territory shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to the minister. The resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Witnesses should speak clearly and into the microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. I would also like to advise witnesses that answers to any questions on notice should be noted by you today and responses sent to the Secretariat by 4 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, Friday, 12 November 2021. There will be no extensions to this timeframe due to the 18 November reporting date. I invite you to make a brief opening statement should you wish to do so. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
Thank you. My name is Susan Bultitude and I'm the Assistant Secretary for Corporate Tax Branch at the Australian Treasury. You've already heard from our colleagues at DISA on this issue, so I will just keep my remarks brief. As you'll be aware, the bills impose a levy as a tax. The Treasury portfolio is responsible for developing legislation to give effect to taxes, and this is why that we are responsible for developing these bills, and it was Treasury ministers that have introduced them into Parliament. Obviously, we've been working very closely with DISA on this issue, given that the role of these taxes in the decommissioning exercise that they are responsible for. I might limit myself to that. I'm happy to take you through an overview of the levy, but I think you've already heard a lot about it this afternoon and previously. So I can either do that, or I can hand you over to my colleague, Mr. Winkler, if you'd like to drive straight into detailed questions.
Yeah, look, I think we can take it that all committee members have got a working knowledge of how the levy and the legislation which has been presented to the Senate. So I think we'll move straight to questions. So Senator Chisholm, do you have any questions?
I do. I put this to DISA as well, who kindly suggested I put it to yourselves. I just wanted to get a sense of how the Department or Treasury established the 48 cents per barrel as being the appropriate value. What was the basis for this formulation?
Simon Winkler, Director of Special Tax Regimes at Treasury. As was announced in the budget, the costings for this measure are not for publication due to commercial sensitivities around the tender process that the Department of Industry is running at the moment. In broad terms, the 48 cents per barrel equivalent represents a judgment about collecting those estimated decommissioning costs. And as our Department of Industry colleagues have commented this afternoon, certainly we do not know what the total decommissioning costs will be in the end, but that number does represent a judgment about collecting those potential estimated costs within a reasonable time frame from the government's perspective. So I think that's the basis for the 48 cents per barrel of oil equivalent.
And is there anything you can tell me about the formulation that was used to work this out?
I mean, that given the way the levy operates, I mean, it operates on the basis of offshore petroleum production license holders being liable for their production to that 48 cents per barrel of oil equivalent applied to the amount of production that they have in a given levy year. I mean, in that sense, mathematically, the levy operates in a reasonably straightforward fashion. The judgments around, so things that are important in that judgment are obviously the levy rate and the amount of production that's anticipated amongst levy holders in the levy years.
What about the end date of financial year 29-30? How was that date chosen?
Why
was that date chosen?
Yeah, so Senator, so that end date is chosen to ensure that the levy is in place and would reasonably be expected to be a long enough period of time for the Commonwealth to recover its costs. Now, having an end date fixed in the levy is a clear signal that the levy is a temporary measure. The end date, particularly of the 29-30 financial year, while it will be subject to the final estimates or the final decommissioning costs that are incurred by government, is a reasonably conservative choice of date. So we do note that the Resources Minister will have the power to end the levy earlier if the Commonwealth has recovered its costs.
He's also got the power to change the rate of the levy, is my understanding as well.
Yeah, that's right, Senator. He does have the power to determine that the levy can be less than 48 cents per barrel of oil equivalent if the minister makes the determination that outstanding Commonwealth unrecovered costs would be over-recovered if the levy stood at 48 cents per barrel of oil equivalent in a given year. But the minister can only decrease the rate of the levy.
They're pretty somewhat unusual powers for a minister to have in this type of legislation, isn't it?
Well, those powers represent a desire for the Commonwealth government to fully recover the costs that it incurs in relation to the decommissioning and remediation, but at the same time balance the need for the levy to come to an end once those costs have been recovered, given that it's uncertain at this stage what those final costs will be. So we did need, or the government did need, a mechanism that would be flexible enough to deal with an uncertain amount of cost.
Just on the bill itself, it introduces a new definition of decommissioning. However, the current Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act does not use the same term and instead requires removal. NOPSEMA policy follows this act, and companies must apply for and justify any deviation from removal requirements, which is a phrase NOPSEMA use, maintenance and removal of policy, or removal of property policy. Why has the new term been used in this act?
So the definition of decommissioning activities and costs that are and unrecovered decommissioning costs that's used in the bill is intended to be broad enough to cover the range of activities that the Northern Endeavour Task Force and the Department of Industry will undertake in relation to the decommissioning activities. The situation is a bit unusual in the sense of the Commonwealth Government taking on responsibility for those decommissioning activities, and so the definition used in the bill is intended to align with the range of potential costs that the task force and the Department of Industry might incur in the decommissioning activities. The bills themselves, being concerned with the imposition of the levy, are not seeking to impose requirements around what standard the decommissioning is to be undertaken to, or any of the regulatory or physical requirements for the decommissioning. It's there to serve the purpose of capturing those range of expenditures that the Commonwealth might incur.
Treasury published an exposure draft of the bills in September, and the definition of decommissioning included the phrase removal of subsea infrastructure. In the version before Parliament, this has been updated to read removal or any other treatment. When was this added and why?
The final drafting of the bill was undertaken in consultation with affected Australian government agencies, so including the Northern Endeavour Task Force. The decision around changing or using the final definition that is in the bills today reflects the broad range of costs that the Commonwealth might incur and doesn't seek in itself to impose any requirements as to how that decommissioning might be undertaken. As I say, I mean, that decision was taken from an operation of levy perspective, as opposed to what the physical work requirements might be on the decommissioning process.
Okay. So who asked for that specific change?
I'll have to confirm, but if I may, but my recollection is that that request was via the Department of Industry in the sense of being a technical definition around the activities they were undertaking. But I might have to take that on notice, Senator, to confirm that.
Okay. Well, they sort of said they didn't know anything about it and said to put it to Treasury.
Okay. Well, I'll take that on notice, Senator, as to where that wording came from.
And just final one for me. Who else did you consult, or did the department consult as part of, or Treasury consult as part of this legislation?
So Treasury undertook, with the Department of Industry, undertook a targeted consultation with APPIA and its members prior to releasing the exposure draft legislation. Then, of course, we released the exposure draft legislation publicly.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Chisholm. Senator Patrick, you have the call.
Thank you very much. Okay, I just want to understand, in relation to the Northern Endeavour, there were a number of different options, or there were other options that were put up in response to the circumstances, a levy being one of them. Did you consider any other options?
You're correct, Senator, in that other options were considered. So sorry, if I take your question, Senator, in terms of Treasury's role in developing the levy legislation, other options were considered by government. Treasury did not necessarily lead on options outside of the levy. As Ms. Bultitude mentioned at the start, Treasury is responsible for the levy legislation because it is tax legislation. To the extent that there are non-tax options available, those are not necessarily options that Treasury would lead.
Okay, but what were those options?
I just have to consider, Senator, so the obviously considerations around different options for dealing with the Laminara Corallina fields were considered by government at the time. I just have to confirm whether I'm able to disclose what those options were. As I say, our area of Treasury is not responsible for leading on those policy matters.
I wouldn't ask further information, just what's within your knowledge.
So, Senator, I might just have to, if that's okay, I might just have to quickly defer and come back in the course of this discussion, if that's okay.
All right, perfect. Okay, we'll come back. Okay, we can come back to that. The expectation is if you're not able to answer that, I would expect you would refer the matter to a Minister for a public interest immunity. But for me, this committee may seek to have another hearing to look at other witnesses to see what they may say, and that's the context in which I asked that question. Why is Treasury not implementing a financial security for decommissioning in the case of offshore oil and gas exploration and recovery?
Oh, well, Senator, that's a policy decision for government as to whether there should be a financial assurance mechanism. Treasury is not implementing a financial assurance mechanism at the moment, but I mean, that's a decision for government.
How did you come up with the 48 cents per barrel?
So, Senator, I mean, the 48 cents per barrel is a judgment about recovering the estimated costs that the Commonwealth will incur in the decommissioning activities over a reasonable time frame. Now, The actual costs the Commonwealth will incur are obviously uncertain, but also through DIS's procurement process, there's commercial sensitivity around disclosing what the Commonwealth might expect those costs to be at this stage. So the 48 cents does represent a judgment about recovering the estimated costs over a reasonable time period.
Has that been modelled at all?
So we have, so yes, Treasury has completed a costing of the levy as to how much would be collected in various years based on the 48 cents per litre, but per barrel, sorry.
Does it come up to the 350 million that others have been talking about?
So the Treasury in the budget, the numbers are not for publication due to the commercial sensitivity.
But this is modelling. You're saying the modelling is based on real production numbers. Is that? I mean that they would be aggregated, not individual companies.
Oh no, sorry, it's not for publication, not because of the commercial sensitivity about individual taxpayers, but because of the sensitivity that the Commonwealth is running a procurement process at the moment through the Department of Industry, and the total amount that the Commonwealth seeks to collect from the levy will go towards funding those costs, and so.
But how does that work? I mean, there's the way this legislation appears to work is that separate to this levy, there is a relationship, but separate to the levy, someone will put in a tender saying, I can do this in this particular way for this particular cost, and someone else may say something different. It's competitive with either none of the parties seeing what the others are putting in, and indeed the annual collection rate doesn't tell you anything about the total cost, because someone may say, I can cover this off in 2 years. Another tenderer may say, I can cover it off in 3 years. So I can't see any relationship or any sensitivity around what it is you'll collect, because it's not tied into an ultimate absolute number.
Yeah, so estimates based on future production. We haven't published Treasury estimates of future production. So I can take that on notice and provide to the committee as soon as possible the maximum amount of information we can about the costing, if that would be helpful, Senator.
Okay, but you see my point about sensitivities. These are very decoupled things. Just in terms of a bit of transparency, will the and this, I apologise, I don't understand the other legislation as well as perhaps what I should. You'll be aware that companies with a turnover of more than $100 million have their tax disclosed by the tax office under tax transparency regimes. That includes corporate tax, it includes PRRT. Is this a tax that would then fall within the transparency regime of the current legislation, such that we could see, that Woodside paid this amount of money in levy and ExxonMobil paid this amount of money in the levy and so forth?
So no, it wouldn't, Senator. It wouldn't form part of those disclosures. Is
there any reason why that's not the case in the development of the legislation?
So it's open to government to publish aggregated information about levy collections once that's commenced. The question about whether the ATO is required to publish the individual taxpayer information as well is not one, as you point out, that's not one that's required in the legislation, but that is a policy call for government.
The question in some sense goes to, was it even considered? It might not be in there because no one even thought about it, and I'm not saying that's a problem. I may seek to amend it such that it is reported, but if you were to present to me here a reason why that's a bad idea, that would have influence over whether I did that or not.
Oh, well, I mean, Senator, I'm not aware of why you couldn't do that, given the disclosures that are already there.
Okay, thank you. Have you made any determination about? I mean, because obviously you've looked at what it is that the annual levy would, or what the levy would produce annually. You've looked at a time frame over which this might be levied as a maximum. Has Treasury conducted its own analysis as to the total costs of the operation of the Northern Endeavour and its subsequent decommissioning, or is, I presume you've relied on a ROM cost of some sort from industry?
I can see if there's further information available from my fiscal group colleagues within Treasury, but usually the Department of Finance would oversee expenditure-based costings, and Department of Industry, I expect, will have been through the process with Department of Finance to confirm their estimates and the reasonable estimates of expenditure that they're.
So I'm just going to what is in essence a question about complete process. We've already asked questions relating to how much it is, and industry have been reluctant to answer that. I just wanted to know, in your calculation of how you would approach this, that you did at least have some ROM costs available to you.
Yeah, so Treasury has not separately costed or modelled what the decommissioning cost would be, but we have, as is standard in the budget process, we have relied on costings and estimates through the finance and industry portfolios.
Okay, and just in terms of the makeup of the cost, I did ask this of industry, and they said I'd be best to ask you. I understand that the ongoing operating costs of Northern Endeavour will be included in the cost that is covered by the levy. They were pretty adamant about that. I think they were less sure about the legal costs associated with the litigation that's currently going. Maybe I'll just ask you what's included in terms of cost coverage by this levy.
Yeah, okay, Senator. So the cost coverage includes the direct and indirect costs incurred by the Commonwealth in relation to the decommissioning and remediation obligations. So in terms of some of those indirect costs, that does include things like legal expenses, insurances that the Commonwealth is required to take out. So it does include those things. It obviously includes direct expenditure around the procurements that the task force enters into. It does not include things like Commonwealth financing costs. So I think I did hear that question raised earlier.
I did ask that, yes.
Yeah, so it does not include things like, to the extent that the Commonwealth is financing its general government, general budget sector expenditure, doesn't include that financing cost, but it does include legal costs and insurance costs and other indirect costs like that.
What about departmental costs? I presume that they're not included?
No, it does include relevant departmental costs as well.
So the cost of the Northern Endeavour Task Group inside the Department of Industry is a cost that will be recovered through the levy?
Yeah, that's correct, Senator.
Okay. Do you have a comprehensive list of it? Is it described in legislation, or is it in the EM? Is it something that will be prescribed by regulation?
So the legislation currently refers to costs directly and indirectly incurred by the Commonwealth, and it mentions some specific things, but that's not an exhaustive list. So I can also take on notice to follow up what disclosures. So yeah, so there's no exhaustive list in the legislation.
Sure. If you could put one on notice, provide one to the committee on notice, I think that's helpful to the committee, but also helpful to the industry that will eventually have to bear the cost of it. I think we should be open and upfront with them about what it is that they'll be asked to pay for, and the taxpayer understanding what it is that we'll be asked to pay for. So thank you very much for that. You were going to get back to me with another answer.
Oh, I was, and
other options considered.
Yeah, so if we would like to take that on notice, Senator, so that we can consult with the Department of Industry as well. I appreciate they've just been on, but as I said, Treasury was not the lead agency.
Sure, and again, I don't want to probe into the details of those options. It was really just what Treasury was aware of. Because clearly you were part of the decision makers in terms of going down this particular pathway. So, all right, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Patrick. Senator Cox.
Hello, thank you. Just one question. In relation to sort of the frame of risk management, what's the plan if global demand drops sharply and the costs can't be recovered in full by 2029, 2030?
Thanks, Senator. So the legislation does end the levy in 29-30. Now, in terms of the question of the plan for post then, so as I mentioned earlier in this discussion, that 29-30 date is a reasonably conservative estimate. So to the extent that the Commonwealth has unrecovered costs at the end of the 29-30 financial year, that would be a decision for government to decide. The legislation would end, the levy would end, and it would be a decision for government as to what they do in that instance.
So have there been any, as part of risk, assessment or risk management framework, proposals or ideas about what government might do? Because obviously there will be some indication leading into financial years before that around global demand that have been proposed as part of this bill?
So no. So we expect, Senator, that 29-30 date, given current production and production levels, that is a conservative estimate. Now, obviously, the expenditure, that very much depends on what the Commonwealth's expenditure ultimately is. And that is an uncertain factor. But given that and production, we do consider the 29-30 year to be fairly conservative.
Great. In the interest of time, I'll put the rest of the questions on notice. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Cox. I appreciate that. And with that, I thank members of the Department of Treasury for joining us today, and thank you especially in terms of being the last witnesses, which meant you got all outstanding issues directed to you. You took a number of questions on notice, and I note that the time to provide answers to those is 4 p.m. this Friday, Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, because we have a very aggressive report tabling timetable we need to meet. So thank you for appearing as witnesses today. And that concludes today's public hearing. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank all of those who made submissions and for the witnesses making themselves available and their ongoing cooperation in this inquiry. The committee now stands adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.